ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the first session this morning, which will be devoted to questions of climate and energy. I have to admit that if we lived in a perfect world, free from the COVID pandemic, the five of us would be sitting today here on the stage. Most probably in this perfect world, we would be greeting ourselves on the great achievements in terms of decarbonization of our economies, in terms of development of our societies, in terms of perfect quality of our perfect lives, of course, in harmony with nature. However, today, on the 16th of September 2021, the reality is quite different. The Polish representation in this panel has been unfortunately reduced by one person. The British team connects with us remotely. Instead of greeting ourselves, we are all, as humanity, receiving heavy criticism from the scientists from the IPCC panel. Conclusions from their latest report can be interpreted in only one way. We are facing a global climate catastrophe. And we know it. Yesterday, during the opening of this forum, practically every speaker was referring to the issue of climate change, saying that this is one of the most important challenges of our time. In Poland, climate change and the need for energy transition have finally gained the necessary political importance. Also, business, civil society, even basic households have become aware of benefits resulting from better care for our planet. COP24, held in 2018 in Katowice, largely contributed to such a change of attitudes in Poland. What is even more important, COP24 in Katowice resulted in the adoption of the so-called Katowice Rulebook. This climate package sets out the essential procedures and mechanisms that make the Paris Agreement operational. In Britain, climate change is also an extremely hot topic due to the upcoming November COP26 conference in Glasgow. The expectations towards this conference are also extremely high, I would say even bigger than in Katowice a few years ago. But the fight against climate change shouldn't just mean the need for creation of new documents. Also, it is not a matter of fiercely defending one's national interests. It is not an expectation that in Glasgow we will find one best solution for the climate change problems. Let's be frank, with over 200 parties to the Paris Agreement, there is no one-size-fits-all solution to climate problems. You can disagree, but for me, the fight against climate change is about doing our best, here and now, wherever we are in our professional and personal lives. It is about taking responsibility for ourselves, for the others, for today and for tomorrow. But how you define doing our best is another issue. And this is the topic of our today's morning bilateral exchange. We will discuss the Polish and British paths toward low-carbon future, green post-COVID recovery, and possible outcomes of the COP26. And I am pretty sure that our debate will be very meaningful because we've got a fantastic team of experts with us today. I will start with Juliet Davenport in order of appearance with introductory remarks that will follow. Juliet, a founder of Good Energy, one of the biggest companies in the UK in the renewable energy sector. And this is also a person who is empowering people to be part of the solution to climate change. And this empowerment is at the core of all her activities as advisor, as innovator, as expert, as lecturer, and in all the other functions that she holds. Honorata Nyga-Łukaszewska, on my left hand, present here in Warsaw, is a lecturer of the Warsaw School of Economics. She specializes in energy security issues, international economics, but also energy-environment conflicts, which might be of high relevance for today's discussion. She also has experience in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Poland and also worked in, during COP14. Anthony Froggatt, our second British speaker, is Deputy Director and Senior Research Fellow in the Environment and Society program in Chatham House. He has worked as an independent consultant for a number of years, and I am pretty sure we will have a chance to talk about his latest report that was published 2 days ago. Before we get started with the debate, just a few housekeeping notes. Timing. We started on time and we will have to end on time. This means that we will have to stop at 10:45, our discussion. Simply, I think that you don't want to miss the coffee break and the possibility to discuss all the outcomes of today's debate on the corridors and drinking coffee. When it comes to the agenda of today's discussion, we will start with introductory remarks of, let's say, 5 to 8 minutes by every panelist. And this will be followed by a session of questions and answers from the audience here in the room and also through our live chat. So don't hesitate to ask questions. If ever you have any, I will get them and I will ask them also to our panelists if there are some. So maybe let's simply hear from Juliet, then Honorata will follow. Anthony will be the last one to present his initial thoughts.
Good morning, and thank you for that introduction. And thank you for inviting me to speak this morning on something that, for me, has been my life's work. Something I've been working around climate change and renewable energy for the last kind of 25 years. So 25 years ago, I was a climate scientist. I was interested in doing something practical, and you mentioned going directly to consumers. Consumers are the people who use energy. The way we consume energy fundamentally impacts on our climate change impacts. And when you go through that sort of story of the UK, when I started Good Energy, had 2% renewables in the renewable energy energy mix. We're now closer to 45% renewables. And that journey has been a really interesting eye-opener, and has sort of allowed me to think through what are the key components that you need to have a transition, and how fast can you transition. And I guess I think of it through 5 pillars. So the first pillar is, what is a country doing on research and innovation and design? How are we thinking about the technologies that we're investing in for the next 10 years? The next part is, what does the infrastructure look like? Most of the Western European countries, or the European countries, grew up in a world which was, they grew their economies in a high carbon infrastructure world. So we have things like electricity networks that were built for centralized power stations. We have gas pipelines that deliver gas to people's homes. And we have a transport system that was built up around using petrol and the internal combustion engine. So that infrastructure as well means that transitioning to a new world, you've got to think about how do new technologies play into existing infrastructure. You've then got the regulatory and policy framework, which gives you the framework for financing renewables. And that, again, the UK has, I think, 11,000 pages of regulation. As an innovative and new entrant into this market, it is a minefield to try and find your way through. And I'm sure that is a similar challenge in other countries. And then coming to consumers, one of the things quite often in my early years in the renewable sector, people would always forget that they were generating power for somebody. So you don't just deliver power to the meter outside somebody's house. Actually, going beyond the meter, understanding how they use that power, when they use that power, is incredibly important. And it's been the big forgotten part of the energy sector for years. And then finally, we have to think about, what are the skills we're going to need to deliver this low carbon vision? We've basically created a workforce around high carbon. So whether that's in the UK in the oil and gas industry, Poland in the coal industry, how do we transition that workforce to support us to deliver this low carbon? And how do we make sure that that transition works really well? And I guess when you look at those 5 areas, there are different speeds. A lot of the time when people talk about transition, they focus on policy. But if you just focus on policy and you don't have those other parts in place, then you can slow down the process. If you don't have consumers on board, then you don't have political will. If you don't have technologies coming through and design coming through that allows us to put technologies into people's homes, then you slow again with technologies that don't suit the end purpose. One of the things that came out this year, 2 years ago, from the Climate Change Committee was their most recent report, which showed that the next steps for the UK particularly are going to be more difficult. We've done the easy stuff in a sense, that change on switching out technology-led approach in the electricity and power markets to get to 40% renewables it's not straightforward, but it's relatively large scale and you can do that. The next parts are going to be much difficult. We're going to have to deal with variability in power inputs from wind and solar. We're also going to have to deal with the fact that we have to decarbonise heat in the UK, and that is going to need consumer input, and we're going to have to think through that. And then finally, on the transport side, actually what's fascinating about that is that the regulatory piece where essentially outlawing the internal combustion engine from 2030 in the UK and across Europe, have we seen this massive move, and that actually is where we've seen an improvement in the technology and consumer uptake. Where those two have come together, I think we'll see electric vehicle uptake really accelerate now for personal transport in the UK. But we've still got to think about freight, and we've still got to think about how do we move large, bulky things around, and electricity is not necessarily the best way on that. So that's how I see the vision in terms of not every country needs exactly the same blueprint, but those are the constituent parts. If we need to move at pace, which we do now, we need to start to think across the board, not just in policy area, but across those 5 areas to really shift any country at speed.
Thank you very much. Honorata, your turn.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting. I'm very happy, Juliet, that you brought those issues, because actually a number of them, I think, are crucial when it comes to energy transition, however we would like to define it. But I think that, and I would completely agree with you, that all the low-hanging fruits have been already picked up. So right now we are in the middle of, I would say, more difficult, more challenging times. And that does not only refer to the British economy, but I think that it particularly depends to Central Eastern European economies. I think that the COVID impact is unprecedented, but will have a huge landmark on how the energy transition pace will look like in the future. So we know that the British economy have been severely impacted by COVID, even more than repeatedly brought up a case of the US. So the question is how in those conditions we can find resources and how we can to some extent encourage companies and industry to go into more challenging direction. I think that in case of UK, there's another issue that has to some extent overlapped a period that we are in, and this is of course the Brexit. So there is a number of companies who've been saying that once the Brexit happened, they've been on the top of the first lockdown. However, when calculated, number of them significantly decreased the exports to the EU, and on the other hand, the imports from the EU have been also to some extent stopped. And the question is how are we going to go into the direction of this nature positive economy? I would say that there are a few solutions, and to some extent, Green Deal is, I would say, an answer to that question. And of course, Green Deal in general is to bring the economies the climate neutrality. So we've been talking a lot about the net zero innovation So to some extent that refers to the idea of R&D innovations that are needed for the energy transition. That brings net zero mobility, but also that encourages to withdraw from fossil fuels. So we've been very often, we've heard that the time of fossil fuels have just ended. But the question is, are we just before the next era, or this is just happening? During the last conference that I was attending, which was in Rzeszów, we've talked a lot about the hydrogen. So I think that hydrogen nowadays is a kind of fuel that will help us to reach those goals. I believe like 10 years ago, the MIT study on the natural gas said that the natural gas is going to be a bridge fuel to the hydrogen era. So now we are actually thinking that we are just in the middle of the revolution, and we are knocking at the door of the hydrogen era. And UK is also a very good example of that, since in Wales there is one of the biggest research facilities on the use of hydrogen. The very good example of how countries use, let's say, green funds or green recovery funds is the OECD database that shows that specifically countries that lead in the energy transition, and that's of course the case of Germany, are putting a lot of money to the R&D investments. If you compare that, for instance, with UK, here, again, this R&D green investments are substantial. But again, in the same statistic, Poland uses lots of regulatory incentives, maybe not that much R&D investment outlays. So I would say that this is a challenge, and this is a challenge for all the economies. I believe that one of the issues and one of the last steps that has very clearly showed a path towards greening the economy was also UK's presidency in the G7 group. The very interesting communication after the G7 summit gave us lots of the insights on how the countries can achieve climate neutrality. But the question is whether it's going to be only a declaration or whether it goes into operational pipeline, as always, I would say. But I believe that it builds a political momentum before Glasgow. And the question is, what the Glasgow will bring. I understand that the crucial issue behind it, and this is something what UK has been putting top of the agenda, is going into the nationally determined contribution, so NDCs. So we'll see. Definitely UK is quite, I would say, ahead of even European countries, committing to 68% of the decrease, while in EU we do have 55 as of now. But yeah, I would say that the question remains open, and this question will be answered in Glasgow.
Thank you very much. And I will now hand you over to Anthony.
Thank you very much, and really good to be with you. The final comments really do tee me up very nicely in terms of what I'd like to say in terms of the climate negotiations. And the question is, what is the impact of the Katowice Rulebook? And I think it's important to recognize that the UNFCCC and the international climate negotiations are part of a process. We have troughs and peaks in terms of the importance and the topics that different of these COPs, these conferences of the parties, discuss. As was mentioned, Glasgow in sort of 6 weeks' time is COP26. It is a very important COP. It is when, for the first time, we will be looking at the NDCs, as the previous speaker mentioned, these nationally determined contributions. And it's important to reflect. They were first set before Paris in 2015. And there has been significant changes in the climate change debate, almost unrecognizable in some sectors. We are much clearer about what the science is telling us in terms of climate change, the consequences in terms of direct risks, i.e. increasing flooding or increasing temperatures, But also we're starting to see on a much more regular basis, there's a systemic risk and the cascading risks where impacts in one country, so that a crop failure in one country is affecting migration, which is affecting another country. So climate change's reach and its impact is significantly increasing. And I think it is very clear over the last 5 or 6 years, the consequence of that. I think the other really important change is one of optimism, is we are seeing low carbon technologies and systems, and I stress and systems, being put in place that really can deliver services that are as cheap, if not cheaper, and in some ways better than the existing ones in terms of fossil fuels. If we look at the price of renewables since the agreement in Paris, I think at Paris people were saying, we think soon renewables will be competitive with fossil fuels. We're now seeing the International Energy Agency and others saying in many parts of the world now it is cheaper to build renewables than continue to operate your fossil fuel plants. So we have a totally different dynamic in terms of what can be achieved and over what time scale. So things have changed since Paris, but Glasgow is absolutely fundamental. There's a few things that's just worth mentioning in terms of what are the challenges that we face within a couple of months. Firstly, obviously, the mitigation targets, the NDCs. Rightly, the UK has been highlighted as having a very ambitious NDC. It is probably one of the most ambitious in the world. Important to stress, though, it's not about just setting targets, about how you implement them. And there was a very good quote, I think, from Lord Deben, who is the head of the Committee on Climate Change, that gave the UK 8 out of 10 for setting targets and maybe 4 or 5 out of 10 for meeting them. So setting targets is one thing, but we need to meet them. And that's many of the things that Juliet mentioned in terms of the building blocks of good policy. So the NDCs, UK is doing very well, EU is doing well, US, the introduction, President Biden has rejoined the Paris Agreement and has set an NDC that is 50 to 52% below 2005 levels, is a real step forward. But not all G20 countries have done that. And I think that's what we will be looking to in the coming weeks. And maybe even next week at the UN General Assembly, will some of the key countries be bringing forward new climate pledges? I do hope so. But what is clear at the moment is that we are still some way off what is required in terms of the Paris Agreement, in terms of the overall temperature objective. So we do need countries to step up in terms of Paris and the NDCs. Just before moving on from mitigation, it's important to mention that it's not just about the targets, and there is many good opportunities in the coming months to really shift the options for mitigation. And there are sector initiatives phasing out coal, electric vehicles speeding up, lots on energy efficiency. All of these things can be dealt with through cooperation and collaboration on the international stage. So that's another thing to look out for. I think the second important area for us to assess is the question of international climate finance. And the developed countries have pledged that there would be $100 billion a year made available to developing countries for adaptation and mitigation. And this pledge was made in and around Paris, and it hasn't yet been met. So I think many people will be looking and seeing, will the developed countries step up and make more funding available for other countries? And I think this is a really important issue for large numbers of countries and civil society around the world. So again, I think something to look at. And two other areas. One will be, as was mentioned, the Katowice Rulebook was a key deliverable from that COP24. The whole Paris Rulebook hasn't quite been finished yet. And so people will be looking for Glasgow to hopefully sign off a number of other issues, in particular in terms of carbon markets, things around transparency, and really clarifying how the ratchet mechanism will work to ensure that we continue to see improvements within the mitigation targets. And finally, the challenge for COP26, as we are facing today, as we're in different parts of the world discussing these key issues, is the extent to which the COVID situation stops and restricts access and stops some of the dialogues. Because COP26 isn't just about the sort of the signing of agreements. It's about building ambition. It's about building confidence. It's enabling cooperation in the future. And so having an inclusive COP, either through people being present or through virtual workshops and discussions, will be absolutely crucial. And I think that is a really difficult issue for the UK government to face. So thank you very much indeed, and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you to the three of panelists. And what I suggest, I will start with quick, free warm-up questions to the panelists so that we check how it works, how we are able to interact in this hybrid connection. So maybe let me start with a question to Anthony. In your opinion, last 1 year and a half, the COVID time, was that paradoxically a good or bad time for the fight against climate change?
I'm not sure this is a quick question, really. But ups and downs. I mean, I think what we have seen was a rapid reduction of emissions last year. So industrial activities slowed down and stopped. People traveled less. People bought less in some cases. So there was a rapid reduction of emissions, which is positive. But it's then bounced back up again, because the economies and people's behaviour has gone back to in some degrees to what it was beforehand. But, so good and bad there. I think what has happened to some degree is money that was made available for economic recovery in some places has been earmarked for green projects, but I would say not to the degree that was necessary. So only a relatively small percentage, somewhat or 10 or 15%, I think, on the international level, was earmarked for green developments. And I think that was a really wasted opportunity. What we don't want to be doing is supporting businesses that within 5 or 10 years will have to be wound down because they aren't compatible with a stable climate. So I think that was a wasted opportunity. I do think that probably the most optimistic thing is that people are starting to see that things don't have to be as they always were. And I think that's an important mindset for addressing climate change. At the beginning, you mentioned in an ideal world, we'd all be in the same room. Maybe not. Maybe this is the ideal world, is that we can communicate, we can hold virtual conferences in which the debates are as lively, we can get as much out of it, and we haven't had to fly to Poland. So I think some things have changed for the good, and I do notice that within Chatham House. As a foreign affairs think tank, we will shift away from insisting that everything be in person. So I think some things have been changed forever, which I think will be positive.
Thank you, especially for the last comment, because I was expecting some of you to tell me that maybe the perfect world is not the one that we had before. Now I have a warm-up question to Honorata. We have 6 weeks left to the COP. What we can do, what we can change, what can change in general, so that this moment in Glasgow becomes a success?
Well, that's a tough question. I think that 6 weeks is, this is too short to have. This is a too short period of time to have like huge declarations, and I bet that the negotiating teams have already made clear their positions, and they do have the agenda that they want to play with during COP 26. But I believe that COP26 is, like Anthony mentioned, something more. I mean, beyond just the, let's say, negotiating event. This is a moment in time, and I think each year that was something what we've been looking for, when the countries are also showing their commitments, but in a way of, I would say, political commitments to climate neutrality. And this is, I would say, something more, and that goes beyond numbers that they would be negotiating, beyond different side events that the negotiating teams are participating in. So in my opinion, COP26 is something more than that. And as I said before, with 6 weeks, you can do nothing, but I bet that negotiators have already made clear what they want to actually achieve. And no wonder that those positions are, I would say, strictly attached to economy's situations and economy's resource endowment. I think that very often depicted the situation of the UK is far different from what we have in Poland, right? So if you have the electricity generation, which is in majority based on either natural gas, which is said to be, let's say, the most friendly fossil fuel of all, and then the nuclear. And if you compare it with Poland, which is highly dependent on coal, then there's no difference that those positions will be, I would say, diverging to some extent, right? But I believe that there's a space to find a common ground, and there's a space to actually build a political momentum also around COP26. But if I may, just to quickly go to what Anthony said, I also believe that COVID will be to some extent a catalyst for positive changes. But I think that during COVID, we've seen that very precisely, that the consumer patterns of using energy have changed. Of course, you may say that resulted in decreased industrial use of energy, but on the other hand, there was a huge number of individual consumers who've definitely increased their electricity use. But at the same time, I would say there is a huge hope in the youth, because according to the latest opinion polls, throughout the world, this is the generation, also the Generation Z, who seeks the answers to climate issues and is very vocal about it. I would say that 20 years ago, nobody would be that vocal about climate issues as the Generation Z is now.
Thank you. Now, last question on my side for the moment, of course. To Juliet, we had the past, we have the present time discussed, and for you will be the future. What for you would be the perfect 2022 year like, right after COP?
Right after COP. So I think if I look at, just coming back to the builds that we're seeing at the moment, one of the things I think we're going to have the political situation put forward, as Honorata talked about, in terms of what the situation in each country is. So they will be taking their current situation, and that will be their negotiation position. I think the thing that will change at COP this year is I do think we will see much more public engagement than we've ever seen before. I think the situations in New York with the flooding, in Germany with flooding, with the fires sort of worldwide, and Generation Z coming through, that pressure is going to become increasingly more important on politicians, and the media is going to follow that. So I think this is what's going to be interesting for me about COP26 is what the media do with this. And then in terms of kind of looking forward to what happens straight afterwards, I mean, I think we're, in the UK at least, I'm already beginning to see the pieces fall together. So for the first time, we've got a real call on R&D, research and development, and innovation. Actually, over the last 10 years, there's been very little spent in zero carbon. Most of the funding in the UK has gone towards medical, automotive, or aerospace. So energy has really been the poor cousin in innovation. And I think we're beginning to see that shift already. We're beginning to see a net zero innovation strategy really come through very strongly. And for countries like the UK, that's somewhere we have a world-leading research facility here. We should be investing much more in this future. So I think really the declaration around countries, what are they going to be doing around innovation and research? And then I think the next piece is, and for me, in a perfect world, we then start to talk about what are we going to do about engaging with consumers? Because as I said, UK is now one of the most important power sources in the UK is renewables. It's like 45%. But the next part, which you've already touched on, will be more difficult. And that will be about reducing total energy usage, energy efficiency, all the more tricky pieces, because it's not big technology fixes. It's actually integrating that into society. And I think that is something that we need to start to, if I was looking to straight after COP, what would I want to see? Well, there's actually, if I take it slightly away from the typical areas, there was a report that went out yesterday from BAFTA, which is the British Film TV Foundation, talking about how much, so the British TV and film industry is a really very important industry for the UK economy. And I think the concept that we talk about cake more on TV than we talk about climate change it takes us back to what is our societal and cultural shifts that we need to see. And I think that concept of actually how do we weave the story around climate change, its solutions, its urgency into our everyday sort of drama that we watch. I mean, the average person in the UK, I think, watches 1 or 2 hours of TV. One of the most influential pieces of input to people's lives is what you watch on screen. And if climate change is completely absent from that and the solutions to climate change, then moving a society forward. So what I would really like to see post-COP is going to be see that actually it's climate change and its solutions are embraced by the whole of society, not just the policymakers and not just the energy companies.
Thank you. I also had a look yesterday on that report from BAFTA, and it was really surprising. And I was immediately thinking, what would be the statistics, the data for Poland? In the UK, the research showed that banana bread was more frequently heard than term wind power and solar power combined in 2020. For me, that was surprising. I am wondering what would be the Polish version of the banana bread, maybe pierogi. It seems to me that after this short, let's say, introduction, to quote Juliet, easy stuff is done. And the difficult stuff is ahead of us. To bring a short summary, it seems that we have growing risks with all the weather problems, weather-related problems, floodings, fires, etc., that we can see as things that happen today, tomorrow, or a couple of days ago, but in fact they are strictly related to climate change. We've got growing challenges, we've got less and less time, still a lot of things to do. We need bigger involvement of climate finance, of youth, of business, of consumers. We have to increase our ambitions. We have to set and also not only set, but meet targets that was underlined by Anthony. We have to invest more, we have to show commitment, we have to engage, and once again, engage with the others, with civil society as well. Still a lot of things remain to be done, and this is a moment when I would like to ask the audience to ask questions, and we have a microphone in here. And I am wondering, what are your questions, what are your doubts, and what questions you have to our panelists. And maybe I will begin with the first person who raised his hand. So please, sir, there's the microphone.
So my name's Stephen Webster, I'm from Imperial College. So I've got two questions. One is kind of Polish and one is more global.
We can't hear you.
Just a second, we'll find another microphone.
So, that's better. Stephen Webster, Imperial College. My first question comes from you really about the media and the media coming to Glasgow. What's the role, do you think, of the Polish media in terms of what's coming? Will the Polish media be covering COP26? How will they cover it? And my second question perhaps is for Anthony, and it's about Chatham House as a community builder. You talked a little about developing countries, but as a policy maker, kind of how are you seeing the role of lower and middle income countries and the way they influence COP26? Because of course that's, they're such a crucial part of the parties. And we know from Fiji and from Bonn, those COPs, there were quite a few parties who were indigenous groups and from low-lying areas. So how are you seeing it now in terms of COP26, in terms of the involvement of lower and middle-income countries? But really my first question is, the media are going to be important. How will this play out in Poland?
Thank you. I think that I will maybe collect 2 more questions and then we will have a round of answers. So maybe, sir, please, can we have microphone here in the front?
Thanks very much. Robin Niblett with Chatham House. Great set of presentations. Thank you very much. I haven't seen the BAFTA report. A very interesting point. I suppose the question would be, what words would you look for? I'd love to know how much reference there was to planet, because as far as I can see, everyone watches David Attenborough's Blue Planet, Healthy Planet, etc., etc. So it may be just not walking through the door of climate change, but walking through a different door is the way of engaging people in terms of words. Specifically, I wanted to, Juliet, you said that maybe the trickiest thing is reducing energy usage and this shift to the role of individuals, heating, etc. I want to ask all of you, I suppose, about the price of energy. I mean, the big feature at the moment in Europe at the moment, and I was in Spain over part of this summer, you could not get away on the radio from discussions about the price for consumers of energy and the huge spike it's taken in really since January this year, and some of the numbers are quite remarkable, both the per ton price on the energy trading scheme in Europe. In Germany, wholesale prices seem to have gone up massively. So how concerned are you, and what does it tell us that at this time, Anthony, that you're reminding us that at some level the price of renewables is so much cheaper, but the experience of consumers is it's so much more expensive? So what's going on? And it's a really bad time, I think, politically, for the price spike to be taking place. So to all of our panelists, those who are studying European markets in particular, what's going on? And is this going to become a real problem?
Okay, thank you. And the third question, there will be another round. I will ask maybe, yes, please. There will be one.
Hello, this is Przemysław Biskup from PISM. I wanted to ask one question concerning the future of the nuclear energy, especially in the light of announcement that was made, I think, yesterday evening, concerning the British, Australian, American program of building up nuclear submarines. I mean, nuclear powered. But my point is that you can't really have such a program without parallel civilian nuclear energy program, because otherwise it's not feasible economically. So what's the future for the nuclear energy, especially taken that nuclear energy is not just about energy, it's also very much about hard security and geopolitics?
Thank you very much. Maybe I will call upon Honorata first, because it seems to me that the question on media might be very relevant to your experience and your work. You have to know that Honorata is also working on some, let's say, semantic dimensions of energy aspects, energy security, and it was also one of my questions for the future debate on how you can answer to the media problem and to semantic problem of climate change.
Thank you for this. I think the question was more about the media coverage of the COP, if I got that correctly. Yeah, yeah. Well, that depends on the, I would say, media, and then depends on what the precise person wishes to look at, right? So I would say that definitely there's going to be a standpoint of the Polish team presented in some media, and in the others there's going to be maybe more of the global view, but you don't know it, and I'm honestly not the person to compare that, and I don't feel comfortable with even doing that. So that would be my answer to the media coverage question. If I may take the question on
sure, go ahead.
At the same time. And here I will go a little bit more with the semantics. So, the price issue is one of those dimensions in energy economics, which is, I would say, crucial behind the affordability concept. And that means that for some people, the price of energy would be too high. For the others, let's say that would be moderate. But at the end of the day, it's a question if they can afford it easily, because that's what's at the heart of the energy security. So we say that there is no energy security if firstly there is no physical supply of energy, and secondly, if it's not available to people, affordable to people, because what use do you have of the energy that you have at place, but you cannot afford it, right? And this is something what I think Christopher Frey was trying to say when he built his energy policy hierarchy of needs. So he said, firstly, the supply, then the affordability, and then on the top of that, the climate awareness. And I completely agree with this, because how can you talk to people in developing countries about the access to modern energy if they don't have the access to energy at all, right? So firstly, you need to have the access, then the affordability dimension, and then goes everything else. And I think that that is why Germany is so much ahead of other countries, because firstly, well, they do have this bottom pyramid line met, and they can go further on. So that would be this price dimension question. And the future of nuclear energy, I'm very happy that you raised it, because honestly, Poland is right now in the middle of trying to, commence the first nuclear power plant. And we know that this period has been postponed a number of times. I remember when the first nuclear power plant was to be ready in 2021, the first reactor. But I would say that advantage is that this is one of those, let's say, low emissive fuels. And in number of actually declarations and documents, countries are sticking to nuclear to show that this is one of the options to go through energy transition. Because if you do have fossils, if you do have the intermittency problem with renewables, you have to have something what gives you the base load. And if you give up on coal, if you give up on other fossil fuels, how can you build that? So I would say that this is a kind of decision what will work for you and what will work for you in the transition period.
Thank you. I saw Juliet shaking her head and willing to add something and intervene. Go ahead.
If I can come to the point about wholesale markets and the energy cost at the moment that we've seen. So just to take back a little bit in terms of what is going on right now in the European markets and what that means from a consumer point of view. So during COVID last year, in 2020, power markets dropped significantly. So wholesale markets in the UK went from about typical price, 50, 60 pounds per megawatt hour, to around 20. So in fact, a lot of supply companies lost money because they bought forward in the marketplace. Then demand dropped by up to 30% in the business sector. So you bought power and then you didn't have anywhere to sell it to, and the markets had dropped. What we're seeing now is a recovery and then over-recovery of really driven by gas price in the European markets at the moment. And particularly we're seeing I can't remember which pipeline is out. There's one of the northern pipelines is not delivering. So this time of year is particularly bad as well. It's what's called a shoulder month. So a lot of any power stations go into refurbishment during the summer months, because you can obviously see that they're getting ready for the winter. The timing in terms of when that comes on, plus we've got I think there is a hurricane sitting in sort of in America, which is then becalming a lot of Northern Europe. So you're missing a lot of the wind power. So we've got a kind of whole set of situations coming out of COVID, sort of a particular weather situation, plus you've got gas markets going through the roof. So that is what's happening in terms of passing that through. In terms of what that means from a consumer point of view, initially during the year, they would have been quite insulated because power companies would have forward hedged. But what I think is quite interesting in the new debate is, what does this mean? What actions do consumers have at their fingertips to be able to take action? And previously, you could have just switched supplier or just got, and prior to that, you didn't have any choice. You might switch the lights off. That would have been sort of your action as a consumer action. What I think is going to be interesting going forward is part of the actions that consumers will be able to take will be to put a solar panel on their roof. And by putting a solar panel on your roof, you will significantly reduce your power costs. And we're already seeing that coming through in rooftop solar, particularly in the business sector, where business customers are saying, actually, I want to insulate myself from this changing power market. I'm just going to put solar panels on my roof. I don't have to pay for them because the finance market will come and finance it. And I will sign a 20-year deal where I get fixed power prices. And I think these are some of the options we're going to start to see come through in terms of how consumers can engage with this market. They don't just need to engage and be a passive consumer to a utility. They can actually become an active consumer, prosumers, as we've called it in the UK. And then just to touch on the nuclear program, I mean, nuclear energy is one of the most expensive ways to decarbonise. So if you look at the power cost of building Hinkley Point in the UK, I think it's £120 per megawatt hour is that cost. And what the average cost recently for wind power is like 40 or 43. So there is a significant distance. You need to be a rich country if you want to put nuclear in, essentially. And I think that comes to the point that was being made, is that can you have a domestic nuclear program if you don't have a sort of a security program alongside it? And I think that becomes hugely geopolitical. And for me, nuclear has always been about geopolitics. It's not really been about energy. And so I think we need to look at nuclear in the context of where is it already, what is its existing potential. But I mean, I think the most recent site in the UK was at 21 years since it got the political thumbs up. So my question would be, can nuclear deliver within the timescales that we need on climate change? And since you can build a solar park within 3 months, my view would be you can reduce cost and move much faster if you look at a renewable base. Now the baseline piece is something we need to fix, but to be honest, there are methodologies that we can look at that. So that would be my view on it.
Okay, thank you. Just to satisfy my personal curiosity, what is your view on small modular reactors and their role? It's not that much of geopolitics.
So small modular reactors are really interesting, and I think the work that's going on in terms of the R&D, there's significant R&D, I know, in the UK because I've seen some of it. I think one of the big questions is going to be, where can you put them? Because most of them you're going to need to operate them like a combined heat and power plant. So you're going to need the heat output to be able to make them to work effectively. And the question is, so therefore, do you put them near large urban situations? So do you have a nuclear power station within the middle of a city? Does that work? Or do you actually have sufficient heat need? Because one of the things we quite often think about the technology, but not actually where you use the output of that technology. And I think this, for me, is going to be the big question for small nuclear reactors, is where do you use the heat?
Okay, thank you. Just before I give the floor to Anthony, who is waiting patiently for his turn, there is Honorata willing to just add some point to this.
Yes, Susanna, you asked us to be provocative a little bit, so I'll take liberty of that actually request. So I do have the question to Anthony and Julie at the same time. Juliet, you mentioned that nuclear is about geopolitics, but I think that in general, energy at all in each, I would say, resource or the type of fuel is about geopolitics. We do see that in the natural gas. We do see that in nuclear. I think that we do see that also in renewables. So, I mean, is it not all about geopolitics? In crude oil as well, right? Trying to be a little bit provocative, I'm sorry.
No, that's perfect. That's exactly the point.
My view is actually, I think solar is probably the least geopolitical technology that you can have, partially because you can deploy it as an individual on your house. So if I wanted to build a nuclear power station in my backyard at home, that I would find that very difficult. So the accessibility to the technology, I think, is as important. So if you have a pipeline, you can control the end of it. So you dictate as the owner of that pipeline where that power goes or where the oil or gas goes. And therefore you can dictate whether you switch it on and off, and that's when it becomes geopolitical. You're completely right. And very similarly with nuclear, because you have to have a whole infrastructure in terms of dealing with the waste, particularly, and dealing with the fuel and the health and safety issues related to it. For me, wind power probably slightly more so, but solar particularly is not geopolitical. It's probably one of the few technologies that isn't, in that I can deploy it anywhere pretty much, and anybody can own it. And that's where I think you break down that. I mean, that's why I've always loved renewables to a certain extent, because although it is resource based and you need the resource, sort of anybody can get access to it.
Anthony, on the top of all the questions that you already have to address, I will add just one more. To what extent climate is about geopolitics?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely it is. Maybe I could start with not a contrary to what Juliette is saying, but one of my colleagues at Chatham House always used to say that one of the biggest geopolitical weapons that the UK could do would be to insulate roofs across the UK. Because if we stopped burning Russian gas and importing Russian gas from other places, or gas from other places, that would have a huge geopolitical impact. And I think it's true. If Europe as a whole stopped importing fossil fuels from, let's say, Russia or the Middle East, that changes geopolitics. So insulation is geopolitical, I'd say. So maybe that's a bit contrary to what you were saying about solar. Maybe just to finish that theme in terms of geopolitics and energy, I think nuclear is different because it is I would agree lots of energy is geopolitical. I think nuclear is different because it has a military connection. And it is, I don't think I'd go as far as say that clearly not everyone who builds civil nuclear power has a desire to build military or have a military application for that. But it's very clear that if you want to have a military application for nuclear, it helps having civilian. And it's not just in waste management. Turbine manufacturing is an obvious example. Rolls-Royce makes turbines for nuclear propulsion, and it does for civilian nuclear power stations. So there is a crossover, and it helps with the economics, and I think that's widely recognized. But I don't think that as I said, if you want civil nuclear, it doesn't mean that you necessarily want to have a nuclear weapons program. Just one final point on the sort of the geopolitics, because as was mentioned in the question, the announcement overnight of the strategic relationship, security relationship between Australia, UK and the US, it involves potential sale of nuclear submarines. And I think this is a significant move. We have yet to see what the full reaction from China is. And as I understand it, China wasn't mentioned in the announcement. But it is a clear question of a opportunity, or is seen as a reaction to development in the region, including China. And what we're looking to in terms of COP is Chinese engagement. And China at last year's UNGA, UN General Assembly, it was there that was announced that they would go for a 2060 carbon neutrality target. And I think there was hope that in the meetings next week, there would be similar announcements or announcements from China making more ambition in terms of climate change. So we cannot separate these two issues. And when John Kerry went to visit China 2 weeks ago, this was the public announcement from China in response is we do not separate our climate change activities from wider geopolitical issues. So climate change is part of the discussions and is part of geopolitics. So it is something that we do need to look out for and be aware of. In terms of the other question, I think the other one that was mainly focused to me was the question of developing countries and vulnerable countries at COP. And absolutely, this is I think there is, in terms of my introduction, that I mentioned that the $100 billion. So this $100 billion a year should be achieved by 2020. We haven't achieved that. So I think many countries are looking for the developed world to be stepping up and making more finance available. And it's not just, this is $100 billion of public sector money, and it will be then matched by private sector. It really is important that, although this isn't all that's needed, it is a symbol of the willingness of the developed countries to help the rest of the world. And I think it's quite similar to the vaccine debate, really, as unless we can roll out vaccines around the world and not just in the developed countries, not in the West, then we don't address this question. We will have new variants coming up. And so in the same way with climate change, we can't just address it in a small number of countries. It has to be a global effort. And I think that's what the 100 billion is symbolic of, even though it is not the only solution. And so I do think that we will see, unless more financing available, unless there is more assistance, unless there's more cooperation to help on adaptation. And it's not just mitigation, it's adaptation. We are seeing the impacts of climate change already. And it is those countries that are wealthier that can put in place adaptation measures are far less affected by climate change. We just see this in small periods of times in terms of, in the United States, New Orleans. 15 years ago, there was a climate event that led to thousands of people dying because they didn't have in place the necessary infrastructure. Just this year, we had a similar climate event and a handful of people died, however tragic, but they had been able to put in place measures to withstand more extreme weather events. And that's not the same for other parts of the world. So absolutely, adaptation and finance for adaptation will be crucial to getting a good deal out of Glasgow.
Thank you. I think that financing will be one of the most important elements of the COP26, and this will be the core of the debate. I know there are some other questions here in the room. Yes, sir, please.
Hello, thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. I'm Waldemar Januszczak. I'm the art critic of the Sunday Times in London. Excuse me, I'm something of a trespasser on this terrain. I wanted just to relate something to you which seems incredibly pertinent to me, and that was there was a craze last year for these things in art called NFTs, non-fungible tokens. I don't know if we've heard of them or not, but it was basically a way of selling digital art, marketing digital art in a way that made it sellable, so that you sold something which everybody had access to on their computer, but you're the only person that owned it because there was this sale process involved. Now, what interested me about it was there was a case of a French artist who sold one of his artworks on one of these digital auctions for several £100,000 or euros at the time. But he then went home and worked out that, and he's an artist who was very concerned with climate issues, with ecological issues. He went home and worked out that the selling of that artwork, the carbon footprint left by that, what's called a drop, the NFT drop, was the equivalent of 3 years of energy use in his studio. So that one moment of selling on the internet had actually left a carbon footprint that was the equivalent of 3 years of renting his studio. And I mention this only because I'm interested in the whole idea of the carbon footprint of the internet, the World Wide Web. Anthony, you said that you were saving a certain amount of energy use by not flying to Poland and by staying in London and appearing in front of us now. But I mean, how much work has actually gone into proving that? I mean, by that I mean, is the use of energy involved in the internet, in this endless Zooming that we all did over the COVID years, is that actually something that uses up or creates a carbon footprint that is actually far more dramatic than we know? And I ask that as a question because I'm totally ignorant on these matters, but you must presumably have done quite a lot of research into that. And just on the principle that there's no such thing as a free lunch, is this new digital world in which we are talking to each other across the internet rather than face to face, I mean, is that in itself a carbon problem? That's my question.
Thank you very much for this small provocation. I have a question from the live chat also. In fact, there's a number of questions, but I will right now quote just one coming from the UK. The UK coal-producing regions have still not recovered from the social and economic results of the unjust transition from coal in the 1980s. Are lessons learned a topic of current Anglo-Polish discussion? So I think this might be a question to all of the panelists. And one more question here in the room, please.
Hi, thanks. I'm Rupa Huck. I'm a Member of Parliament for a seat in suburban London. And I wanted to ask really how you can get individual people in suburban London to make those sacrifices at an individual level that may be necessary. So, you know, recycling is something I think everyone does without thinking about now. But then if, you know, when the gas boiler goes, how do you persuade people to go electric, or what are they meant to do? I've moved over to an induction hob, which is a complicated electric cooker this year. I used to like my gas cooker. That's my small thing. But in terms of national government policy, the active travel agenda to sort of make people leave behind the car and do more walking and cycling has been controversial in suburban London. I think it's easier to sell in Copenhagen. How do you get people to do this? What inducements can you offer them? Yeah, and, you know, because often they say back, well, you know, it's China, Russia, whoever, people with oil rigs, they need to sort it out. Me, take the car is not going to solve it. So, yeah, how should we be selling this?
Thank you very much. The good thing is that all of the panelists are willing to react, and they will do so. The bad thing is that we have only 10 minutes left, so I will have to ask you to be quite concise. But I think in 10 minutes we are still able to get very meaningful answers. So maybe let's start this time with Juliet.
Okay, thank you. And thank you, great questions. Actually, I'm going to slightly plug, I do a podcast called Great Green Questions, and we did answer this question about, I had Mike Berners-Lee, who has written a book called How Bad Are Bananas, which I would recommend to anybody who wants to look up the carbon footprint of anything, pretty much. So Mike's gone through what is the carbon footprint of a banana, but also I had him on the podcast really to talk around what is the carbon footprint of sort of Zoom, what is the carbon footprint of streaming, Netflix, what is the carbon footprint of all these things that we've taken up really with gusto during COVID. And the answer is, first of all, you should try and watch a screen with a friend. Is the key thing. So actually, because there's more than one person in the room that we're screening to, this is worthwhile. If you're just screening to one person, it starts to become less worthwhile. And then in terms of the really bad thing, actually, in terms of electronic thing, is Bitcoin. So coin mining is probably one of the highest uses of energy that you can have from a digital world. And it's one of the biggest challenges is where we should probably put them all up in Iceland, because one, they need cooling, and two, they need an abundant amount of renewable power to really justify them. So most of electronics is this kind of streaming is much better than traveling. So yeah, take a look. His book is brilliant as well. And so I would really recommend to look at that.
Anthony, your turn.
And then is it worth me talking about the gas boiler? Sorry.
Go ahead, Juliet.
Yeah, so in terms of switching over to gas boilers, I mean, there are two things in here. One is going to be design about the technology that we move to right now, air source heat pumps, which is one of the key technologies for, I was talking to somebody about this last night, they are noisy. They are not very, they're pretty ugly. And actually, and they're not very appropriate for sort of central London particularly, or any central cities. So we're going to have to see some innovation in that technology as well. It's quite an old technology now. It's basically an air conditioning technology. So again, I would look to the design and research phase that we need to see better technologies for better consumer uptake. But also in terms of gas, all our subsidies on renewables are put on the electricity bill in the UK. And so gas, basically, the gas bill gets away scot-free. So there's no sort of form of carbon tax on our retail bill, whereas there is a carbon tax on our electricity bill in the UK. And one of the biggest things we could do with actually shifting that tax burden to the higher carbon fuel going forwards.
Thank you. Anthony, your turn.
Thank you. Maybe I'd pick up on the just transition question, because it's absolutely fundamental. This is something that gets to the heart of the energy transition in general. It will be the issue that slows down the transition. The example in the 1980s, there was no just transition. The coal mines were closed. But it was partly for political reasons. I mean, it had a political edge to it. It wasn't just about economics. And I think we need to recognize that areas of the country that are highly dependent on fossil fuel, be it coal, be it oil, be it gas, will need support. And we're fortunate in Western Europe that we can afford that. And yet it isn't happening to the degree that is necessary. And I think if we want to have a rapid transition, then having a just transition is absolutely fundamental. It comes back to the point that I mentioned earlier on in terms of the wasted opportunity that the COVID recovery funds is. We need to be developing more skills in certain areas. I mean, insulation is a classic example. It is relatively low skilled, but it is, or in terms of the fitting of it, but there is lots of skills in terms of the manufacturing of the equipment. And it tends to be a real generator of local jobs. So it is creating an economy within localities, and therefore it is very good from a political perspective. One of the issues around coal mining is, and we see this in Germany, is that you have areas that are highly dependent on coal, and therefore they capture that political the politicians within that area, and they are unable to move this forward. We need to be able to create alternatives, local jobs in the area that are, so that people can see a future without their fossil fuels. And as I said, I can see that how we can deal with that within Western Europe, within Europe as a whole, but we also then have to think about that in terms of larger countries. I mean, for example, in China, we have 10 million people that are working in the coal sector. And it's not just the coal sector itself. It's something like a third by volume, by weight of goods that are shipped on the railway in China is coal. So you have on the knock-on implications of if you start phasing out coal, you're affecting the miners and you're affecting the railways. So we need to be dealing with these issues, otherwise we won't get the transition fast enough. And then finally, the question in terms of what can Londoners do? One is, I think there is a bit about the change in the narrative. I don't think it's sacrifice that we shouldn't be asking people to sacrifice things. We should ask people to change, and it's for their own good. And I mean, I do see that in London. As you said, the whole question about traffic controlling measures is on my street. My street is no longer a cut through in terms of cars. So it's slowed it all down, but it's now very annoying if I want to drive anywhere because I have to do a huge loop round somewhere else. And it will force people to shift the way in which they function and which they go around their city. And it is painful, hopefully for a short period of time, as you get used to a new way in which you move around the city. But I do think it's the buy-in, it's the consumers, it's giving people alternatives so that it's not them having to sacrifice, it's people have to change, but ultimately they see the benefits of that.
Honorata about just transition or other topics?
Yeah, just transition. I'd like to also pick up on this. I would completely agree with Anthony that it's not only about the miners when it comes to the transition, but it also is about, I would say, all the supply chain that goes to the mine. So it's been, I think, estimated at some point that if the mines would be closed down, some regions in Silesia region in Poland, and I think it was the city of Rybnik, the unemployment rate would go up to 50%, because it's not only the mine itself, but this is also the industries that are supplying the miners, right? So this is a huge social problem. So that is why I think that if that is tackled in a socially responsible way, that's a chance for success. I'd like to also go back to the issue of how to, let's say, encourage people about the Londoners. Well, I would say that there are three solutions. You can either force them, which always socially strikes back to the policymakers. You can encourage them, which is challenging to be done because it always requires some incentives. Or you can educate them. And I think that it's not that I'm in education business, right? But I think that education gives the best chance and the best opportunity for a change. But of course, this is a long-term process. So you have to probably start with the youngest ones, and probably you'll see the results in 10, I would say 20 years. So again, I believe that education is a key to success in that respect. In the previous round, there was a question about, I think, how to make developing countries, let's say, do some commitments in respect of the climate change. I completely agree with Anthony. Adaptation, adaptation, and adaptation. Mitigation is, of course, important, but adaptation to climate changes, especially within the UNFCCC process, is a key to success. I see that there's been more of the, I would say, maybe not pressure, but a kind of good vibes around commitments of the developing nations. But I must say that whether they would commit or not, this is a question which we've been observing in the UNFCCC process for years. And yeah, the answer, maybe that comes in Glasgow.
Hopefully. Dear panelists, in the meantime, I managed to get another 5 minutes for our session because I think that we can agree that this is a fascinating debate and exchange of views. So I got you 5 additional minutes for 3 persons, and this means that now it's your turn to do my job and to give a short summary in 1 sentence. You can choose either a recommendation or just a conclusion. Tell us what is your final thought on this debate, on the question of our panel, maybe on the question on whether we are doing our best or we are doing enough or not enough. Up to you. If you can make it in 1 sentence, that would be perfect. And maybe let's start with Juliet.
Thank you. I guess for me, the solution to this is more, so the technological side, yeah, we can put more work into R&D and design, but the biggest solution, this is a political and cultural question now. And the reason I talked about the BAFTA report today, because to be honest, politicians don't do anything unless the culture asks them to. So you have to have everything aligned to be able to get a shift. One of the things I remember when they banned smoking in pubs in the UK, which at the time it felt like there was a whole period of time where it felt like that was never going to happen. The politicians were never going to do that. But I think society went through as Onata talked about, the education piece. People understood it was beginning to affect their health. They understood the economic piece, so it was really expensive. And when the politicians actually came round to banning smoking, it didn't feel, people actually really accepted it. There wasn't this big backlash that there was feared to be. And I think for me, the climate change debate is the same. We need to take society and our culture along the route. And our culture has grown up in a high carbon culture where we've been pushed towards consumerism and we've been pushed towards consuming more fossil based products. And we now need to go on a cultural journey as much as a political and technological journey that allows us to move to the solutions of climate change. And that is the piece that I'm beginning to see with Generation Z. And for me, I'm really excited about.
Great. It was a little bit more than just one sentence, but it was very valuable. No. Thank you very much. Maybe this time, Honorata, please.
Well, the short sentence, I would say encourage and educate. So encourage by different means. I think that financial markets has shown very well how you can include green goals into, I would say, different areas. So that's been translated to behavior of companies, and we've seen it as a translation of the SDGs into KPIs of companies, and actually companies are rather willing to stick to that, and this is not the kind of greenwashing as it's been very often depicted, but it's really treated seriously, not as a part of CSR. And again, educate. Without education, I think that the change of behavior, of consumer patterns of energy use, that's not going to take place.
Thank you. So we have a very strong emphasis on social questions, on culture, on education. I'm wondering what's the point of Anthony?
Thank you. Maybe I should just mention the politics and the geopolitics, because I think we are, if there has been one advantage from COVID in terms of the climate negotiations, it has been that it delayed 26 by a year. And that has fundamentally changed the geopolitics, because we had President Biden coming in and him rejoining Paris. We had the Climate Leaders Summit in April when countries put forward more ambitious plans. So we are in a much stronger position than we would have been had COP not been delayed. And I just hope that that momentum can continue, and that what we'll see within the next 2 months is not only national governments making pledges, we are waiting on China, India, Russia, etc., to do so, but also the private sector coming forward with more ambition and more cooperation across the world. So I'll leave on a note of optimism. I think we are in a much stronger position than we were a year ago, but there is still much to do, and we need to take people with us.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, Juliet, Anthony, you cannot smell coffee that is just approaching in the room next door. But I would like to ask the audience here to thank our panelists for these great interventions. Thank you very much, and I invite you first to the coffee break. You've got more or less 20 minutes, and then for the next session on politics and international affairs, transatlantic relations and European security. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you, Juliet. Thank you, Anthony. It was a great pleasure. Trudno jeszcze
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin the 5th session of the Belvedere Forum, Politics and International Affairs, Transatlantic Relations and European Security.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second session of today, which is the 5th session of this year Belvedere Forum. My name is Łukasz Kulesa. I'm the deputy head of PISM Research Office. With the session title, you might ask the question, what it is really all about? Because it seems to be a little bit about everything. We'll try to narrow it down to bits and pieces, so don't worry about it. But indeed, there is a danger that this might be a session for foreign policy wonks talking to other foreign policy wonks. Hopefully not. Hopefully by the end of this session, you will all come to the conclusion that the issues that we are discussing actually have an impact, a direct impact or indirect impact on people in Poland, on people in the UK, and all over the world. Starting with some of the technical issues familiar to those who are already watching us or have been watching us since yesterday. To make this discussion as interactive as possible, we'll of course have exchange here in the panel. We'll also have Daniel Drake hopefully joining us from London. But I would also invite the virtual participants to post questions or comments to the chat function. And I'll bring these questions, these comments into the discussion and also obviously give floor to the participants who are here in Warsaw. Now, we live in what the UK Integrated Review has very elegantly labeled the competitive age. Others use the terms like great power competition, great power conflict, an era of unpeace, or simply the end of the world as we know it. But at least for me, there is a sense that one age, one era is coming to a close in international relations, and something new is starting to emerge, or perhaps the contours have already emerged. A new world which is different and usually the analysts would say scarier than the one that we used to have. So, do we despair? Do we choose to ignore it? Do we fight back? Perhaps as a NATO alliance, as UK, as Poland. I mean, the starting point should be trying to understand as good as possible what is going on, to have a proper analysis of the developments. And in order to help us navigate this very easy waters, we have a great panel. I would start to my left, Alice Billon-Gallon, research fellow at Chatham House Europe program. Then Robert Pszczel, senior fellow at the Pulaski Foundation. Justyna Szczudlik, deputy head of research and also head of the Asia Pacific program at the Polish Institute of International Affairs. And joining us from London and replacing Samantha Job, Daniel Drake, head of the joint MOD FCDO Euro-Atlantic Security Policy Unit. Hello, Daniel, and many thanks for stepping in at almost the last moment. We really appreciate it. Now, I did a little bit of the division of labor to make sure that we take the maximal advantage of the expertise of our guests. So I would like to start with Robert and asking you a question, surprise, surprise, about Russia. As diplomat, as Polish diplomat, as also a diplomat in NATO, you have dealt with Russia for many years. You had the pleasure / displeasure to be in Moscow for a couple of years as the head of NATO Information Office. So no, the basic question is where are we with Russia? To what extent a threat challenge it is? And if you could only also bring into your intervention what is happening in the last days or weeks, including the Zapad exercises. So Robert, over to you.
Thank you very much, Łukasz. Thank you very much for the organizers. Friends, it's great to be here, and I as well confess to my connection to UK. I'm sort of partly a product of the British educational system. I went to a proper comprehensive, and then I went to LSE. And I met my wife, although she's Polish, in London. So there we go. Well, Russia, yes, there's a division of labor. So, I mean, as Łukasz was telling us before, we have to be very concise and short, so leave time for discussions. I could say Russia is a very big country. It's been behaving very aggressively, and I don't particularly like Putin, but I do like Tchaikovsky. But I think you expect a bit more, so I'll continue. Let me actually start with a quote from, no, I'll get to that later. But I would divide, for obvious reasons, Russian policy and therefore the response of the international community, and I primarily mention, of course, NATO, where I worked for 20 years, and European Union, into two obvious, well-known phases. So the first phase, starting from actual dissolution of the Soviet Union, I mean, to use a famous German expression, Wandel durch Handel, which I think most people probably agree has not worked very well. I think the approach of NATO and EU could be described as, over 20 years as sort of Wandel durch Engagement. And, what I mean by this is that if you look, for example, at the EU agreement with the Russian Federation from 1997, it speaks about shared values and lots of other things. I mean, if you look at the Founding Act, concluded between NATO and Russia in 1999, and then even more perhaps about the summit communique from 2010 from Lisbon, NATO-Russia Council, where it's mentioned that both sides are striving towards strategic partnership. These were the hopes of not just a day, but many decades. And I would put it simply that the Western community has bent over backwards to try to engage with Russia, try to develop a partnership of sorts, to try to essentially bring Russia into the fold to the extent that Russia would want it. And those efforts have included many things, various institutional arrangements, specific cooperation projects, various, if you like, openings, science, for example, projects, both, NATO's budget is pretty small, but still, the Science for Peace, Russian scientists have been one of the largest recipients. The same goes for you, etc., etc. And all this has kind of worked. It's always been difficult, but until, of course, first the warning shot was 2008, Georgia, and still remains a problem. But to be very honest, a lot of people thought, okay, maybe an exception. Well, it was not an exception. And then, of course, came, I would argue, 2012, because all politics is local and the events in Russia itself have hardened the stance, as is always the case in Russia. And then, of course, came 2014, the annexation of Crimea and the intervention still continuing in eastern Ukraine. And of course, that's not the end of this, because we had Salisbury attack, we had continuous cyber attacks. I think the most recent one was against, again, German members of Bundestag, surprise, surprise, before elections. We have the whole disinformation campaign, we have attempts to revise history, etc., etc. So there is a pattern, and that's how both European Union and NATO have had to approach it. So the elements of the response, and therefore, if you like, policy, have been developed, and right now, I think the EU, one could probably talk, although it's not sanctified to the fullest extent, but the basic elements are there, which is to push back, constrain, and to engage where possible, primarily with the civil society. Even that is difficult. In NATO, it's the famous 3D. Defense and deterrence and engagement. So you have the enhanced forward presence, you have lots of things that NATO has been doing in order to respond to the challenge, because it is a challenge in terms of hard defense, but also in terms of attempts at malign influence, hybrid efforts, and so on. That is the, if you like, the sad reality. But the saddest reality, of course, is what's happening in Russia itself. We have the so-called elections coming up. I've checked. Apparently, there's only one candidate, which is not only independent, because you can claim there's a few more, but one candidate which is independent, standing, or allowed to stand, which publicly is critical of the Kremlin. That's not a sign of any fair, elections. And that's the reality. And that has enormous consequences for the way Russia handles itself, international affairs. Then Zapad, mentioned by Łukasz. Now, we have to strike a balance, because one of the purposes of this and similar exercises is to actually unnerve the West, to basically make us feel that, we have to do something really dramatic. We have to show signs of fear. We have to be worried, and we have to recognize the great capacity of Russia and so-called allies to make the scenario of the pushback almost unpalatable. This year, the focus is clearly Belarus, not just because large part of the exercise has taken place in Belarus, but also because, of course, the political implications and the scenario itself is highly provocative, as it's always been the case, because we're not only talking about, when you look at the maps, you have, different countries. It's interesting because, one country that's fictitious, that's clearly Lithuania. The other one, Pomoria, that's clearly Poland. But the third one, the Polar Republic, that's probably Norway. So that's actually bringing this. Why? Because the exercise is not just in Russia and in Belarus, it's also about the north and about the Baltic Sea, etc. So we have to deal with this. There's the conventional and the nuclear component and the huge amount of disinformation. But looking more broadly, so at the policy and our response, I would say that if a few years ago people were still discussing the question is, no business as usual, the sanctions, are they sufficient, the right way to respond and how to deal with this information? Today, for example, very interesting article by Ed Lucas, we're talking about exposure and extradition, because that's the nature of the threat in terms of the just of influence. So I would conclude by saying literally three things that, the key elements of our response, and I think it would be good to discuss how effective, how successful it is. Of course, that depends what's possible, what the political market can bear. But it involves certainly high degree, much improved of our awareness. Secondly, it involves policy as it is, but also the key requirement is unity and political leadership. And that goes for issues such as resilience. I hope we can go in depth on this. And also on questions related to how to stem how to respond to the very aggressive military posture while not succumbing to certain sort of defeats. Let me end on a quote, just to sort of liven things up. It's a quote from 1961. I won't make any apologies. This is actually a quote of the orders issued to American GIs who were stationed in Berlin. Soldier, why are you in Berlin? To show the Berliners, your allies and the communists, the best soldiers in our army. To protect United States lives and property. To help the West Berlin police keep law and order. Here comes the quote, which I wanted particularly to accent. To fight like hell, if necessary, for United States rights and a free Berlin. The point is here that I'm trying to make is that we need some of that, not necessarily in that sort of literary spirit, will and desire to be very forceful about our willingness to defend essentially our rights, our interests, and our principles. I'll end at this point. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we could perhaps broaden this quote not just to American GIs, but also to British, Polish, French, and other soldiers, for example, those in the NATO enhanced and tailored forward presence. But we will come back, I'm sure, to some of these issues and themes that you raised later on. Now, let me move to Justyna. Justyna was an established China expert before it became fashionable. Because right now, almost everybody claims to be an expert on China, and everybody has something to say about China. But Justyna was doing that before it became fashionable. So you would be the best person to perhaps reply to the question, or are we in competition with China? Are we in conflict with China? And how the Chinese also see the current situation and the current development? So Justyna, over to you.
Thank you, Łukasz, very much. I'm dealing with China for, I think, 15 years almost. And if I may, because I'm responsible for China in this panel, and we have this in the program, the statement that assertive China, and I would like to focus on that and also trying to answer your question if we are in a conflict, competition. But let me offer you Chinese perspective at the very beginning, if I may. I fully agree with the statement that we are observing right now that assertive China. I would even say that we are observing aggressive China in the recent months. And in my humble opinion, when I look at the Chinese foreign policy modification under the Xi Jinping's term, I think that China has already entered the third, let's say, period of this foreign policy reform. Very, very briefly, if I may. At the very beginning, during the first term of Xi Jinping, it was 2012, 2017, it was China announced the same something which is called great power diplomacy with Chinese characteristics. It was the moment that China decided to be proactive. And Xi Jinping officially barred from Deng Xiaoping dictum of keeping low profile, introducing the slogan, forging ahead. And it was as a diplomatic cornerstone. And the mindset was that China should be agenda setter, not a norm taker or a norm follower. And the second term, beginning of the second term in 2017 was the kind of, let's say, the strengthening this approach. This was a continuation, but with a more, with extended toolkit and the means to achieve this goal. But and why the rationale behind this change of the first term and the beginning of the second term was that it was a very favorable international environment for China. It was the kind of a weakening global power of the US in the aftermath of the financial crisis. China coped quite well with the crisis, and it was a self-perception that China is really strong, has strong leadership, and it is time for China to lead, to be active. And now we are in the third stage of the third period, which is called outside China as a wolf warrior diplomacy, which is China is becoming not assertive or even aggressive. And of course, Chinese explanation why, or the rationale why China is becoming more assertive or even aggressive is the fact that situation globally has changed, which means that there is a global backlash against China, that situation in international environment is very unfavorable for China. It was the beginning, it was 2016, 17, when we look at this China Made in China 2025 program and the Chinese open, let's say, policy for technology transfer, that we as a Western world became aware what China is doing with the technology, critical infrastructure, and access to the high technologies. And of course, the beginning of the Trump administration and trade and technological war with China, as well as the change of the approach of the EU when it comes to China, the process of sharpening policy on China. So China is becoming aggressive. There are many examples of this aggressiveness or assertiveness. Let me give you just a few examples. I have a long list, but recent examples. It was mentioned by Mr. Pszczela about the disinformation by Russia. So China launched disinformation activities in Europe last year. It is a novelty for us because we are pretty accustomed to the Russian disinformation. It was Chinese disinformation activities about the COVID mostly. Also, the recent cyber attacks, some threats openly presented by Minister of Foreign Affairs, for example, last year in Europe, and he was here in Europe during the visit when he said that Czech will pay a heavy price because at that time there was a Czech delegation in Taiwan. Also, the recent story about Lithuania and the fact that Lithuania officially withdrew from 17+1 and would like to improve relations or strengthen ties with Taiwan. And articles in Global Times, which is a tabloid, but under the party control, with a really offensive quotations like crazy tiny country full of geopolitical fears, some hints that China, Russia, and Belarus should join hands against Lithuania. Also, when it comes to Taiwan, for example, some hints from expertise that China is changing its priorities from opposing independence to seeking unification, and extremely nationalistic speech delivered by Xi Jinping at the ceremony of the 100th anniversary of CPC, the Chinese Communist Party. There's quotation from Mao Zedong, for example, or one quotation, if I may: China will never allow any foreign forces to bully, oppress, and enslave, and anyone who wants to do so will hit the head of the wall built of Chinese people blood. So this is the examples what is Chinese assertive or even aggressive steps. And few words about the rationale, because I think the reasons. To be frank, I think that there is a domestic driven reasons, but because we are just before the very important event, which is the party congress, 20-party congress, that would be held in China in autumn next year. And of course, China is not a democratic country for sure, but there is a kind of let's say, Xi Jinping's campaign for extending his leadership to the third term. He will probably, if he became the leader of China for the third term, it will be some kind of a breaking the unwritten rule that chief of the Communist Party should retire after 2 terms. And it is a kind of I don't know how to say, electoral campaign within the party, but also society. So I do not expect any, let's say, moderate Chinese approach internationally till the end of the next year, when Xi Jinping would like to secure this, the third term. So maybe just a few words about this, where we are, if I may, just a few words about our response to the Chinese, let's say, assertiveness or aggressiveness. Of course, we as a Western world, European Union, United States, we are aware what is going on, of course. And when it comes to the response, I think that we share the diagnosis that China is a challenge or even a threat. But of course, there is some differences in how to deal with this, let's say, Chinese challenge or even threat. The European Union is trying to still have contacts with China and keep channels open with China, and would like to use some instruments that are pretty, let's say, neutral, just to address some specific Chinese behavior. So the list of defensive measures that the EU is setting up is without naming China, when you look at this investment screening, due diligence mechanism, all these mechanisms, there are no any China word. Because we would like to have contacts, we have and maintain economic cooperation. The United States is trying to build a coalition against China. So in that sense, there is a kind of a different approach when it comes to our response to China. But we are just before the first meeting of the council. I was a technological council that was launched in June during the US-EU summit. And I think it's a very good step. We should look at the first meeting that will be at the end of this month in Pittsburgh, because there is a moment that maybe we could focus on some very important issues when it comes to China, just to mitigate this Chinese approach when it comes to technology transfer. And I do hope that we could coordinate our efforts and not to, let's say, double and doing different and approaching to China in a different directions.
Thank you very much, Justyna. Through Moscow and Beijing, we traveled back to Europe. Perhaps two things, kind of full disclosure. One, that Alice is in fact French. And second, that we in fact worked together for a while at the European Leadership Network. So it's not the first time we meet and discuss European security and defense. But Alice, for you, a question about this European quest for strategic autonomy, in which the arguments about Russia, the arguments about China, also arguments about the United States feature a little bit. We just had the State of the Union address, and Ursula von der Leyen announced that there would be a summit of European defense next year with President Macron. We had all this noise after Afghanistan. This is the time for Europeans to get our fate into our own hands. So where we are and what's your prediction? Will we make it this time?
Thank you, Lukasz. That's a big question. And I think it's really interesting and telling that at a British-Polish forum, we're having a discussion about European strategic autonomy when Poland and the UK are two countries that are not only not associated with this concept, but fiercely opposed to it. So I think it says a lot about the discussions of these times and all the rhetoric coming from Brussels about the need for more strategic autonomy pretty much on everything at this stage. So I'd like to say a few words about the debate on European strategic autonomy. And I can use my French identity to do a bit of French-splaining, which is a big part of my work when it comes to European defense anyway. And then I'd like to say a few words about the sort of EU-NATO dichotomy, which I think is a false one, especially when it comes to operations outside of Europe, where I think the UK is actually growing sort of close to France in terms of sort of understanding and using minilateral formats rather than the big institutions. So first of all, European strategic autonomy, I think, generally speaking, it would be defined as the ability for Europeans to act with partners when possible and alone when needed. And in the field of security and defense, this has implications that are political, strategic, operational, and industrial. So we won't dive into all of these straight away, but just to say that this is sort of the big scope of that project. And the reason why for London and Warsaw this is a problem, I think, isn't just the title of the concept. Two things, European and autonomy. First of all, when we talk about European strategic autonomy, what Europe are we talking about? And usually this is seen as a very EU concept. It's usually seen as EU strategic autonomy, in part because the term has been used by the EU in its global strategy since 2016, and it's usually being sort of conflicted with a wider European approach, which obviously, both for the UK outside of the EU and for Poland, this idea of a EU-only autonomy is not something that can fly. But then the idea of autonomy is even more interesting because it's really about this concept being seen as anti-American, in part because pushed by the French, and as a way to actually weaken transatlantic relations instead of strengthening it. The idea being that, if Europeans want to be more autonomous, then that will drive the Americans away. And I think here the French are to blame a little bit in terms of how they push this concept, because I think, and Robert and I have been discussing this, it's sometimes a sort of counterproductive and confusing way. Because on the one hand, there is this big rhetoric about EU defense. Lukasz has mentioned the new EU Defense Forum or Summit. that will be organized by Ursula von der Leyen with President Macron during the EU presidency. So really seeing this push by the French for more EU defense, PESCO, European Defense Fund, etc. Whereas actually in practice, I think the French vision for European strategic autonomy is way more flexible. It's multi-forum, it's multi-format. And when the French talk about Europe de la Défense today, they're not talking just about the EU, they're talking about NATO, they're talking about bilateral relationship, minilateral formats, etc. In part also to be able to work with the UK, which is now outside of the EU. And I think that this core idea that Europeans should be able to do more and to rely less on the US, especially when it comes to the security of their neighborhood, and I think particularly in the South, is a diagnosis that, to me, the Brits have been getting closer to over the past years. And I think this needs to be highlighted, you know, despite Brexit and despite the recent UK-US New Atlantic Charter during the summer, which I think is a topic of discussion in itself, there has been discussions in Whitehall over the past years rethinking the transatlantic relationship and the UK-US angle in that. And I'm sure Daniel will cover that in a second. But my understanding is that, you know, even before Afghanistan, even before the Brexit deal was finalized, what you heard in London was this realization that it's no longer possible to rely only on the United States, especially in the European neighborhood. And something that the British Defense Secretary Ben Wallace said even before COVID, early 2020, was that the UK needed to diversify its partnerships and its assets. And this is something that is quite close to the French vision for European security and defense. And I think this is also where Poland and the UK are in slightly different position, because for Poland, the main #1 issue is obviously Russia, collective defense, the eastern flank. But for the UK, seeing itself as a sort of global power, and seeing European interest elsewhere around and beyond the European continent, the UK needs partner with whom to work in the Mediterranean, the Middle East, Africa, etc. Which in a way leads me to my second point, which is which partners can that be and in what format? And something that, you know, has been flagged in the discussions even yesterday at the conference is that I think we tend to frame the debate around the European security architecture as a dichotomy, you know, between the EU and NATO, which I think is mistaken and is not exactly what the reality has been on the ground either. Because I think we can all agree that, you know, NATO is the cornerstone for collective defense, and even the French wouldn't, you know, push on that and wouldn't want the EU to do collective defense, at least not in the very short term or even medium or long term. But the reality of the situation has been that European defense cooperation, especially when it comes to operations outside of Europe, has moved outside both the EU and the NATO framework. What we're seeing more is sort of small formats, minilateral cooperation between so-called European willing and able member states working in those sort of flexible formats. And why is that? I mean, on the one hand, just the fact that on the EU side, CSDP has been useful for peacekeeping, but there is very little political will to do more. And the last EU defense toolkit that has been revealed is more about capability development than true action and deployment. And we've seen it again with Kabul. I won't get into the whole battle group discussion and whether having yet another tool for entry force is reasonable when we're not using the ones we have. But there is definitely, you know, disillusion in terms of what the EU can offer. And then even when it comes to NATO, you know, NATO is still very strong on collective defense and henceforth presence, etc. But there is an intervention fatigue. We'll see the conclusion of sort of the post-Afghanistan, maybe the end of the out-of-area operation moment. And, you know, if European allies wanted to act together, let's say in the Eastern Mediterranean, would they use NATO as a format, you know, given the tensions with Turkey, Greece, France? So all of this has really pushed Europeans to this trend that we're seeing, which is to do small formats, either as frameworks, and we can here mention JEF, the UK-led Joint Expeditionary Force, which gathers Nordic and Baltic member states to focus on high readiness force for the Arctic and the High North, which gathers both non-EU and non-NATO states, but also French-led framework. It's usually either UK or French-led framework, which I think says a lot about the role that the UK and France have to play in terms of the dynamism for European defense. The French have launched the European Intervention Initiative, which is also outside of the EU and outside of NATO, and brings together about a dozen of European states. And this is something that we're seeing more and more, which is those formats and operations, like the Takuba Task Force in the Sahel, and like Operation Agenar and Mazo in the Strait of Hormuz, which are, to me, European strategic autonomy as capability to act in practice, because this is Europeans getting together and actually delivering on the ground. So there are discussions about, fragmentation, what that means for the EU, for NATO, but I think this is the route that Europeans are taking, and I think this is a trend that is a plan B that works as long as political will and cohesion is limited both in the EU and NATO. So I think we'll come back to that and we can cover EU-NATO relations. I think this is the European strategic autonomy that the UK and even possibly Poland could get behind. Thank you, Lucas.
Thank you very much. Thank you for zooming in on the concept of strategic autonomy, because many times in the general discussion it is reduced very much to cliches. Daniel has been waiting patiently, but also you have the privilege or the comfort on hearing the previous speakers, so you could agree or disagree with their assessment of the situation during the course of your intervention. But of course, we would be interested in kind of your, but also official, given your position, views on the issues that we are discussing. I would also add some questions about the state of NATO, the new strategic concept, and perhaps you could tell us a little bit about this new kid on the block, the Australia, UK, US, AUKUS. Kind of sounds like a rare disease that you don't want to get, but apparently AUKUS is with us. So if you can tell us a little bit about it, that I think would also be useful. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Łukasz, and well, good morning, everyone from London. I know it's nearly your afternoon there. It's a fantastic pleasure to be able to join you all remotely from an empty room in the basement of Chatham House, particularly given the strength of the UK-Poland relationship across defence and security. I know you've been talking about the relationship more broadly, but I think on defence and security, I've visited Warsaw a number of times and worked a lot with Poles on a number of issues, and it really is clear just how many shared priorities we have in the defence and security field. I mean, I think what the other speakers have captured, particularly on the threat from Russia, the rising challenge from China, and also the way, as Elise has described it, that Europe may respond to these challenges is definitely something that is very familiar. And I was pleased to learn a new word as well from Elise, the word French-splaining. I'll try not to do too much Brit-splaining, I think, during my intervention, but it was I certainly agree with a lot of that. I think perhaps given the time, Łukasz, what I'll do is to frame the sort of strategic comments that I have in the context of NATO's new strategic concept, because NATO is undergoing a very interesting process at the moment that started with the reflection group that reported, that was set up at the London Leaders meeting, which I was very pleased to have been involved in organising. That then led to the NATO 2030 programme, which was endorsed by leaders at their summit this year, and that summit in turn endorsed the idea that leaders should work towards a new strategic concept. And NATO hasn't done that very often. Over the past 30 years, there's been roughly one new strategic concept every 10 years. And prior to that, they tended to come at sort of very strategic moments in NATO's evolution. So it is a really important opportunity, particularly given that over the last 30 years, NATO's strategic concepts have been public documents, for NATO to set out very clearly not just the kind of snapshot that you get through a communique, but also its kind of medium and longer term perspective towards performing its core tasks over the next 10 years. So what I thought I'd do is to set out some of our key priorities, and in the course of doing that, hopefully make clear where the UK stands on a number of these issues. The first, and as Justina's already, and Robert have set out, it's a really important opportunity through these discussions to be clear about how we view the threats and challenges, not just as they stand now, but also as they are likely to evolve over the next 10 years. And as the UK, we made a very valiant attempt to do that through our integrated review. So it's very helpful for us to have that as a strong starting point. And I think we've been able to sort of, if you like, bring in much of that analysis, working particularly closely with partners such as Poland, into some of the key strategic documents that NATO has been putting out recently. So the summit communique the London summit communique, was the first time, believe it or not, that NATO had produced any language on China at all. And the summit communique from this year's meeting was very clear in paragraph 55 that China's stated ambitions and assertive behaviour present systemic challenges to the rules-based international order and to areas relevant to alliance security. So we're not talking about China and Russia in the same breath. It is very clear, and we have been clear again for the last 2 years, that Russia's aggressive actions present a threat to Euro-Atlantic security. But I think what we are talking about in the context of China is addressing systemic challenges to try and avoid a situation in the future where they can become more obvious and present threats. So getting that language right on both Russia and China will be extremely important. And if any of you have read the 2010 strategic concept, which in many ways I think is a brilliant document, it does cover new technologies, it does cover cyber, it's superbly written, very pithily written. One area where I think, regrettably, as Justina said, regrettably, the world has moved on is in assessing the threat from China. And believe it or not, the bulk of the language on Russia in the 2010 document comes under the third core task on cooperative security rather than under the others. So getting that balance on threats and challenges right in the new concept will be extremely important. Secondly, I think there is an opportunity through this process to reshape NATO's core tasks. And I think the consensus will be that the 3 core tasks, collective defence, crisis management and cooperative security, continue to be the right ones. Again, when you look at the text of the existing document, it's clear that they need to be significantly looked at. Now, I think for the UK, and I'll say a bit more about this at the moment, an important element of this will be looking at the first core task, and I think we have a real shared interest in this between the UK and Poland, to understand what we mean by collective deterrence and defence. Not just collective defence, but collective deterrence and defence. And NATO, of course, NATO's new deterrence and defence concept that was agreed very recently, that is leading to a whole set of plans that sit underneath that, will be we need to bring more of that into the overarching strategic concept, and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. The crisis management core task, which obviously the last concept was developed at the very height of the Afghanistan intervention. Clearly, we are all going to want to learn the lessons of what happened with the Resolute Support mission, and we will also want to reflect, if you like, the strategic implications, not just of what's happened in Afghanistan, but some of the other core sort of conflict zones, if you like, around NATO's periphery. And I think, as other speakers have said, we're very clear that there is a real kind of arc of instability that spreads around Sakhar's area of operation, around the Euro-Atlantic area, and is absolutely right that NATO, under its 360-degree approach, looks very closely at those areas. But of course, what NATO may wish to do versus what other actors may wish to do is something that will be the subject of debate. But nonetheless, I think how we define that crisis management core task in light of Afghanistan, the reality in Libya, the increasing presence of Russian mercenaries in parts of Africa, for example, all of that is something that will be a very important part of the discussion. And then in the area of cooperative security, and as a diplomat, I would like to think that a document that is looking 10 years out will actually be able to project some alternative futures and opportunities to engage with other partners around the world. And indeed, the Reflection Group report, if any of you have read that, is very clear that there's a real opportunity for NATO there to build stronger partnerships, not least in the Indo-Pacific, but also, for example, by welcoming Ukraine into the Enhanced Opportunity Partner Programme quite recently. In other areas, though, of cooperative security, of course, we know that we face huge challenges, and another part of my responsibility is looking after our policy towards the OSCE, and I think it is hugely challenging for a cooperative security organisation such as the OSCE to function if you do not have all of its participating states prepared to act in good faith. So, as I say, our second priority is to look at ways in which we can reshape the core tasks. Our third priority is to bring in much of the defence adaptation that's been going on over the last 5 or 6 years at NATO, really since 2014, into our NATO's next strategic concept. And that includes a focus on integrated deterrence that goes all the way from tackling the kind of disinformation that Justina was talking about, all the way to the provision of our own continuous at-sea deterrence and the involvement of the other main nuclear powers. It's also really important that we reflect the work that NATO, as well as many of us individually, have been doing on emerging and disruptive technologies, where we see an important role for NATO reinforcing what we're all doing nationally. And it's also important, as other speakers have said, to bring in this focus on resilience that Robert was talking about. And at the summit this year, we saw a strengthened resilience commitment. Clearly, much of that work needs to sit at the national level, but there is a role for NATO, for example, in standard setting in that as well. And then our fourth priority is on burden sharing. Now, there will need to be a kind of new sort of settlement, if you like, a sort of a refreshed look at what we mean by burden sharing. We remain very committed to the Defence Investment Pledge, and I know Poland does as well, as two countries that are committed to spending over 2% of GDP on defence. And I won't dwell too much on the NATO-EU relationship, because I think what Elise said was extremely relevant on that. Suffice to say, quite often when I give these talks, we have a chart up on the screen that shows all of those countries that are members of the EU and of NATO, who clearly have a single set of forces and will want to be very clear about what commitments they're signing up to in one organisation that may affect their commitments in the other. But it's also the reality that the majority of NATO's defence spending, the vast majority, comes from allies that sit outside of the European Union. When you look at those allies that were extremely active, for example, in the Afghanistan evacuation, they're countries such as Turkey, the US, the UK. These are countries that sit outside the European Union. So any kind of settlement, if you like, any new relationship or developing relationship between the EU and NATO has to reflect both of those realities. And then finally, under burden sharing, as Elisa said, a lot of the sort of dynamism in the way that we're pursuing our defence and security objectives can sit outside of those formal structures. So we have the Joint Expeditionary Force, we have V4+1, we have the Northern Group, and then you will have seen yesterday the announcement about the new defence partnership or expanded defence partnership between the UK, the US, and Australia. And just on that, Łukasz, I'm sure you will have followed the announcement last night. This is, the next phase in a very deep and long relationship between three like-minded countries. You will have seen that the first priority is for us to work together to help Australia develop nuclear-powered submarines. And actually, there'll be some further detail on that programme given to our Parliament later today. So I certainly would encourage you to look out for all of that. But I think the important point for this forum to bear in mind is that those kind of small groups and informal arrangements can reinforce the formal institutional relationships that we have through NATO and through the United Nations and so on. And that's something that we wish to continue to pursue. So to conclude, as the other speakers said, this is actually a really pivotal moment for NATO. Whether it's as significant as 1991, we can debate, but certainly it's one of the most significant things that NATO has faced over the past 20 years, perhaps since new allies such as Poland joined the alliance. And I think there's huge scope for the UK and Poland to work together, I think particularly in this deterrence and defence area, where we're looking at doing some specific work together at NATO, and we'll look forward very much to taking forward that cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this list of tasks for the next strategic concept, and also for the Indo-Pacific bonus explanation. We'll pick up pace a little bit. So now, as we would be hearing questions and comments, I invite you to provide short and witty responses. And let me immediately start with the first one, which probably you might have expected, which is about the impact of the latest developments in Afghanistan to everything that you said in the first round. The fall of the Republic, return of the Emirates, the chaos and the tragedy of the evacuation. How does it affect, or does it affect at all, the analysis that you just produced? And I suggest we mix up a little bit. So let me start with Alice, then I'll come to Daniel.
Sure. I've been thinking a bit, especially since I got to Warsaw, about the impact of Afghanistan, both on the UK and on Poland, and trying to see whether the two countries had sort of the same conclusions into how it affects them. And my understanding is that from a Polish position, it could be a positive thing to have sort of this end of the mission in Afghanistan and potentially seeing the US refocus on other theaters of operation that it seems more crucial to its security. And I think it's about being clear that what happened in Afghanistan was just a very deliberate sort of US refocusing on, well, China, first of all, but that does not mean that the US is abandoning its commitment to European security, and especially the eastern flank either. So from my understanding is that from a Polish perspective, this could be a positive thing, sort of refocusing, especially refocusing NATO on the core mandate of collective security and defense, and sort of putting an end to the out-of-area operation period. And in terms of transatlantic relation, my reading is that I'm guessing Warsaw is more concerned about Nord Stream, about arms control, than about specifically what is going on in Afghanistan. And from a British perspective, I mean, as I've outlined, there was a huge reaction in the UK, also because of the involvement and, you know, the loss of so many British lives during the 20 years in Afghanistan. And there have been very lively discussions and debates in the House of Commons around this topic. But I think that beyond that, the discussions in Whitehall about the US-UK relationship had been ongoing for a long time. And I don't feel like this specifically will be a game changer. I think London had been rethinking its relationship with the US, which is absolutely crucial to its security and defense objectives, but also understanding that, you know, it needs to step up. And it was really interesting to hear British Defense Secretary Ben Wallace saying, you know, we tried to see if other European states wanted to stay involved, but, you know, obviously no one really wanted to stay there without the US. So for me, on the British side, we shouldn't sort of exaggerate this as a huge, you know, betrayal from the US, etc. I think no Europeans wanted to stay in Afghanistan without the US in any case. And it's just about US repositioning and refocusing on key strategies, which could be positive, at least for Poland when it comes to collective defense.
Thank you very much. Now the view from Whitehall.
Thank you. I mean, I guess in common with pretty much everyone here, I found what unfolded in Afghanistan over the last couple of months utterly tragic, and we've been proud that we've been able to support the evacuation of many thousands of refugees to the UK. We're also very proud, actually, that we are supporting NATO's effort to host some of those Afghans who worked with NATO currently in Camp Bekele in Kosovo, and we look forward to a proportion of those coming to the UK very shortly as well. And given the sacrifices, I know many Polish soldiers, many British soldiers, and many other NATO allies lost personnel in Afghanistan, it clearly has been a source of huge sadness. I think it's still very early to look at learning lessons. There have, of course, over the 20 years been other processes to try and learn lessons at each stage, if you like, of NATO's presence in Afghanistan. But I think what we need at the moment is some genuine reflection that, first of all, looks backwards, but perhaps not too far backwards, given those other processes, but looks at the circumstances that led to where we got to in August, but also looks forward and looks at the strategic implications for the region and for NATO and allies' interests in that region. For example, in how NATO focuses on its, if you like, second core threat under its deterrence concept, which is that from terrorism. So we need to do that in quite a sober way. NATO now has a process underway, and certainly as the UK, we will be fully involved in that. And then finally, as Elisa sort of alluded to, there will be this debate about the balance between collective deterrence and defence, as we will probably call it, and crisis management. And perhaps over the last 10 or 15 years, there's been certainly more public focus on NATO's role in crisis management, whilst actually behind the scenes, those of us involved in NATO policy know that there really has been a focus on the core task of collective deterrence and defence, and a more active deterrence posture as a consequence, and that's because we have seen this threat from Russia present itself in some much more obvious ways. So I think there will be that debate as well, which, as I said before, comes into the discussions on the strategic concept, but looking at both the lessons of the past and also the strategic implications for the future has to be an important priority as well.
Thank you very much. Justina, how things look from China's perspective?
Okay, so before I would like to say a few words about the Chinese perspective on Afghanistan. One remark about strategic autonomy, because I would like to highlight the fact that China likes very much this notion, of course, because it is perceived as a chance to have some, to enhance some differences between United States and the EU. So there, in the recent months and weeks, there were pretty many articles written by Chinese experts about this strategic autonomy, with the appreciation that is a good step that EU is trying to be more autonomous. About the Afghanistan and what it means for China, I would like to say that we could that there are two messages from China. One is which is official, and I think it's a kind of a disinformation, which means that China is very happy that with the fact that there was a withdrawal of US troops. And that right now there is a moment that China could be engaged, at least economically, in Afghanistan, could take part in some infrastructure projects. It's an official message, which is only official because China will is trying to use for its propaganda the fact that, especially the problem with the withdrawal, and of course the fact that Taliban's took control of Afghanistan, that this mission, the Western mission, ended up with failure. So it is a Chinese official message that that there was an intervention, Western intervention, and it ended up with a failure. But it's an official message. The real Chinese interest is that China is really concerned about the instability of Afghanistan right now, after the fact that Taliban controls the country. China is really afraid about the militant operations in the country and the spillover effect on to the region, about also Uyghur fighters, so the security reasons is the biggest problem and the biggest concerns. And when we read what Chinese experts are talking about Afghanistan, they pretty openly say that for now there is no possibility for China's economic engagement in Afghanistan because of instability, because of the fact that the Afghanistan economy is a very bad condition. If I may have a quotation from one more article or interview with one of Chinese experts, and it was a question if, because Afghanistan or Taliban invite Chinese to be engaged economically or in the infrastructure projects, and the answer is that Afghanistan is unstable. There is a problem with the economy, that Afghanistan produces drugs and opium, and if this problem is not resolved, neighboring countries China is a neighboring country, will not be able to accept the invitation for investments. And also there's a question about the BRI, so projects under the Belt and Road Initiative, that China may invest under BRI umbrella in Afghanistan, but there is one condition: when the stability will be achieved. So this is the implication for China when it comes to Afghanistan. And one issue about this possibility, because China, when it comes to Chinese approach towards the countries in a deep political crisis, China is trying to be in contact with all the parties involved. So for me, it was not surprised that China contacted with the Taliban. It's nothing new and surprising. But I think that we could not expect China as a facilitator or mediator when it comes to Afghanistan, but because Afghanistan is very complicated for China due to some religious issues and various groups. So I do not expect, but I think that there is a kind of possibility even for some cooperation between China and the United States in Afghanistan in the future.
Thank you very much. And finally, to Robert, would Russia look more east or east-south? Is it bad or good news for us? And perhaps if you could also have any comments on Alice's reading of the Polish reading of the Afghanistan situation. Is she right telling that, it's, as I understand it, that's basically good for us because instead of crisis management far away, we can focus on deterrence and defense?
Thank you. Well, I mean, there's a lot of myths, or even I would use stronger word, was hypocrisy when it comes to analyzing Afghanistan, the end, rather inglorious, has to be admitted, of the Afghanistan mission. And I have to say, the leading, in terms of the hypocrisy standards, are the two revisionist powers, which is both Russia and China. I mean, you use the opportunity for propaganda purposes, as you said, and Russians are not different, they're not the original. Yes, the West has failed, the Americans have, etc. But then, not so much realization because they knew it, but then of course there's the hard reality saying, well, what about instability in Central Asia? China, of course, they would like to milk various, commercial deals, but who's going to provide the stability? I should mention Pakistan, that probably comes top of the list when it comes to a country which has done as much as possible to create instability in Afghanistan, and now it's kind of crying wolf. So one good example is the recent announcement on humanitarian aid. While the jury is out, and it's one of the few instruments left to actually try to discipline the Taliban, who have not changed. The Middle Ages are kind of back there, but they want legitimacy, right? So there is holding back. But in terms of humanitarian assistance, I think actually France tops the list with 120 million committed, followed by US, UK, Germany. China, 20 million. Russia is not in the list. That is the reality. And it's a basic approach, have a cake and eat it. So, it's not much to say. There's no appetite in China, for example, to do anything to actually, be engaged, because they prefer to sit on the sidelines. Because that's the reality. It's NATO, with all its imperfections, that has been trying to stabilize the situation. Now, the question whether, reading and so on. I think probably in Poland, and of course I don't speak for the Polish government, but I think reading is a bit different. I mean, it is true, it's not a big secret that Poland, one of those countries which has felt very strongly that, even though Afghanistan is one of those mission was not an Article 5 operation, but it came, of course, as part of the big response to what happened September 11. But once NATO did get involved, initially it was actually UN resolution and all the rest of it, but the first phase was a really serious one. And then once the decision was not taken to essentially withdraw, if you like, but continue this stabilizing mission after 2014. Well, there were certain doubts, but unity of NATO is in this context more important. So, to be very honest, those rather alarmist views, they do not come from Poland. They come from, I'm sorry to say again, from Paris in particular. Okay, no longer a French official, but Gérard Araud, former ambassador and DCM in NATO. You might have seen the article in Economist, which is, by the way, another great British contribution to, the understanding of international politics. Fantastic. Written a piece there in which the essence of it is that, well, look, you see, it's a jungle out there, and, you know, our American colleagues are kind of leaving. So, you know, well, excuse me, I mean, it's a bit like with storage, strategic autonomy. You actually kind of, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Of course, the world is complex and you can call it a jungle, but, you know, US, to best knowledge, in Poland and other places, is not withdrawing from NATO and withdrawing from, more important, NATO commitments, but it's various ideas which are and suggestions which are made in this context, which may actually make various people think that, you know, there is something wrong with that, and that's just not the case. So I would not say that there is any kind of celebration. Of course not, because all the good words I've said about our US colleagues, well, it's true that the mission itself, the final, and it was not the best planned operation, and there are big questions also in NATO. In that sense, the French position has merits, that there's something not perfect when it comes to consultation. So I would expect a lot of discussions during the strategic concept debate that it's just started about how to improve the consultation map, because it's not working. But my final point is simply this: because of Afghanistan and a few other things, and the world is kind of not waiting, this things happening in Korea, right? There is actually a case for more cooperation. You know, Europe and US have more interest now, you know, in a real sense, to actually stand together rather than go down separate paths and try to sort of, you know, because the challenges are real and they require a unified response.
Thank you very much. Let me now bring in the audience. Sir Malcolm was waiting very patiently, so the first to you.
Thank you very much indeed. Could I, if I may, put a question to Justina on China? Because I think I'll sit down when no need to stand, on China. And you referred to Xi Jinping's policy, but of course he has not just neglected, he has rejected Deng Xiaoping's advice that when China becomes strong, don't throw your weight around, because in the short term it might help, but it'll do you long-term damage. Now, is that not indeed exactly what has happened? That Xi Jinping is showing himself perhaps to be a very impressive tactician, but a lousy strategist when it comes to China's ultimate interests. And I'm not thinking just of America's reaction, or Europe's, or even Australia's. I'm thinking about Asia's. China is surrounded by Asian countries. He has, by his policy over the last 2 or 3 years, turned all of them into enemies, or potential enemies, all the way from India right through Southeast Asia to Japan. So India, for example, which throughout the Cold War said we are non-aligned, we do not take sides between the Soviet Union and the West. India hoped to do the same with China, but because of the attacks on the Indian-Chinese border, the Indians now have joined the Quad with the United States, Japan, and Australia. The Indians now have developing a defense relationship with Japan. India and Japan, what do they have in common except China? And yet they now are having joint naval exercises. Recently, a Japanese minister, with the authority of his government, actually said if China intervenes in Taiwan, Japan will see that as a threat to its national security. The first time since 1945, Japan has used language of that kind. Vietnam, given the history of Vietnam and America, Vietnam says openly, in relation to its strategic interests, the United States is a friend and a partner, China is the country they are worried about. And the same could be said for all the countries around the South China Sea, which are in dispute with China. So what is Xi Jinping up to? If I was a member, it's not very unlikely, but if I was a member of the Politburo, able to have a very private conversation with another member of the Politburo, I would say, is Comrade Xi actually helping China's strategic interests? Or has he now created, quite apart from Europe, quite apart from the United States, is he not actually creating a situation where containment is going to be the way in which not just US, Europe, Australia, but the whole of Asia, virtually, seeks to deal with the Chinese challenge? That's not brilliant strategy.
Please note or use your memory with the questions and comments, because we will collect a couple of them. Second is Miha over there. Yeah, and I should probably, over there, the second row. And please start with introducing yourself.
Sure. Oh, it's working. Michał Baranowski, head of GMF Warsaw. Thank you very much for fantastic conversation and wonderful moderation by Łukasz. My question is also about China, but also about Russia. I wanted to use the presence of great China and Russia experts on the panel to help us understand their relationship a little bit better. Some people describe it as alliances. Some others describe it as, friends with benefits relationship, asymmetric one on that one. So if you could, briefly, Robert and Justyna, tell us how you see it from the Moscow and Beijing perspective, and then if I could maybe other members of the panel ask, what do we do about it? What do we do about it within NATO? What do we do about it perhaps in cooperation with our Australian friends, Japanese friends who actually are closer a little bit to that theater? Because of course, looking at it from Warsaw, from my perspective, if we are so connected with what's going on in the Indo-Pacific, not only by that relationship, Russia-China, but also by the fact that we both rely also on the United States that now clearly indicated that they cannot fight two wars at the same time. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I will alternate between questions from our audience here and from our virtual participants. So I've noted the interests and will stay in that corner of the room in Warsaw. But there are some excellent questions coming up on the chat. And I would like to start with the question from Janusz Oneszkiewicz, which is about the level of ambitions related to the scale and geography of high-intensity operations, how they relate to the European Intervention Initiative, but also I would put it more broadly to the goals that the European Union would put itself, most likely in the strategic compass. So this seems to me like a question more directed towards Alice than other members of the panel. Then we have a question by Hendrik Caban, which it's a short one, but probably would require a pretty long response. How to make UK presence in Europe and Asia Pacific more meaningful? I might play a little bit kind of expanding and interpreting, but for me the important part here would be the parallel presence and the question whether the UK would be able to do the same things simultaneously, keep its commitments in Europe and also improve or maintain their commitments and presence in Asia Pacific. I don't know how many aircraft carriers you can have and how many deployments you can make. And the last question from the chat for this session, again about China, from Adam Czarnecki. What is the best solution for the UK and for Poland not to overreact on China? The assumption being that, of course, we might overreact, or maybe we are already overreacting. So there was a lot about China. Let me then start with Justyna, and then I'll invite the other speakers.
Well, thank you very much. I will do my best to answer the question and do it in 3 minutes. It will be it's a huge challenge. About the first question about what is behind Xi Jinping's strategy, having, as I understand your question, that having enemies all around Asia. Well, to be frank, I do not fully agree that Asian countries. I really openly. Talking that you're openly against China. You mentioned India, you mentioned Vietnam, Japan, but I would like also look at the ASEAN countries, and they are pretty, let's say, the position towards China is like balancing. On the one hand, they are afraid of China, and China is perceived by this group as a, let's say, challenge. But on the other hand, they know that they are economically tied to China, and they are living in the same region. So, of course, they would like to have enhanced cooperation with, let's say, United States. But on the other hand, they would like to keep channels open with China. I think this is the ASEAN situation. I was told about this openly in Singapore 2 years ago, that there are many problems with China, but they should cooperate with China. So I think that we can look at this from through two angles. Just to have some better cooperation with, let's say, United States, Japan, United States, to some extent against China, but on the other hand also keeps channels open and channels open with China, and it is, for example, the case of Republic of Korea. So I do not think that we could say that those countries are really trying to build blocks against China. So this is my short answer for this question. About this, the question about the how to not to overreact to China and this Polish response. To be frank, looking at the Polish approach towards China recently, in recent months, but also recent years, that we are pretty, let's say, cautious, or we know what is going on in China, but we would like to have contacts with China and the diplomatic and the political dialogue and so on. So the answer is that Poland goes, let's say, as so we are in the same. We are doing the same as the EU is doing. So we would like to have contacts with China. We do not want to alienate. But of course, we are pretty cautious when you look at this Polish, let's say, stance when it comes to Chinese investments. We would like to have Chinese investment, but we do not want Chinese credits and loans. We would like to have high quality investment. So on the other hand, yes, we invite Chinese investors, but we would like to have control over this investment. So we are pretty cautious. We are pretty aware or some kind of, let's say, challenges coming from China, but we would like to have contacts with China. So I think that this is a kind of it's a process of avoiding overreaction. And of course, we as Poland, we are supportive to all the defensive measures that are adopted by the European Union.
Thank you very much also for adopting this 3 minutes ambition per responses, because we like to bring everyone in and perhaps 1 or 2 questions more. I will now go to Daniel, followed by Robert and Alice. Daniel, over to you.
Thanks, Łukasz. So I'll focus on the question on the UK presence. And an immediate answer to your question, there are 2 carriers, one of which will be permanently assigned to NATO. And I think that, that is a very visible demonstration that whatever our ambitions will be increasingly to engage with other partners around the world, our core commitments to our neighbourhood, the Euro-Atlantic area, remain absolutely rock solid. And I think the integrated review set that out really clearly. I think for us, the question is where are the particular UK strengths that we bring to this collective effort, and through the investment that we're putting into our armed forces, the money that was announced last year, what we're doing is developing a set of forces which are focused on high-end capabilities that are enabled by data and digital, that allow us to act as a framework nation through the Joint Expeditionary Force and so on. And that gives us a particular set of, if you like, attributes that give us something to bring to the table. Now, it's very clear that other big defence players, such as Poland, have their own set of USPs, if you like, of unique selling points that they also bring to the table. And one interesting development at NATO over the last year or 2 is the way in which we as allies have taken forward some of that discussions between us and said, well, actually, if we provide this and you provide that, then collectively we give NATO the capability that it needs, rather than NATO defining sort of arbitrary sort of targets sort of on paper that we know that we may not be able to meet in full. And the UK and Poland have worked very closely on that. But of course, as we also set out in the IR, there's a range of other tools that we're going to want to use to its fullest extent. Our diplomatic network, which is expanded in the Indo-Pacific, but we've also expanded a number of our European embassies over the last few years, and of course organisations like Chatham House and as well as PISM as well. So like any other country, what we are doing is looking at what are those particular strengths that the UK brings to the table as a very open economy, as a committed defence and security actor, and as a member of some of the key forums such as the P5, the Five Eyes, and so on, and then making best use of those. But we're really clear, as the IR sets out, that we will only really be able to succeed in that effort if we work collaboratively with our other partners. I think just on China, really briefly, it's clear that we do need to build our understanding, that we need to work out where we want to engage with China, and also that we take a number of steps that, if you like, actor agnostic, such as the new Investment Security Act that we agreed in the UK, and also this focus on societal resilience as well. But there is also a role for building some stronger partnerships in the region, which again don't have to be obviously directed at one country or the other. It is simply about us building our global presence and our understanding, and I think that's the way that we probably ensure that we don't overreact. But again, we I think made a very valiant attempt to square that particular circle through the integrated review, and to recognise, on the one hand, that China is a systemic challenge, but on the other hand, it is a huge economy, will become only more influential, and in some of the key global challenges we'll be facing, whether that's climate change, whether that's the growing role of space in defence and deterrence. These are areas in which we need to be engaging with China, not only talking about China, if you like. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert.
I'll try to be very quick, so I'll speak very quickly. Two issues, Russia, China, and then what do we do about this? I mean, Russia, China, I think I agree with Bobo Law, who calls it the axis of convenience. Clearly, Russia is a junior partner in this. I think China has been making mistakes because by upping down, they actually copied the wrong bits from the Russian toolbox. The lone wolf, I mean, Russia has long abandoned, the soft power approach. Look at Russia today. It started as a sort of, mixed bag, but now it's just purely propaganda and so on. And China is following that footpath with all the consequences. The same goes, by the way, by doing away, most likely with, well, it has done away formally with this that you can only have be a leader for two terms. That's clearly has implication. But in terms of our response, I think there are four points I would mention. First of all, it has not been mentioned. I haven't even mentioned in the context of Zapad, but it's an important point. It's my mission. It's the lack of transparency. We need to push much more strongly about this, because a lot of people do not always understand that. But this is part of the problem. You say what you like about the West. We are very transparent, particularly when it comes to military. Russia, as we know, has not one exercise has been, conducted since the time that the Vienna document actually came into existence. Always some excuses. And China is in that path as well. It simply has come to a point where I think China needs to be pushed much harder. They're getting away with excuses which are more than lame. They're not part of really any arms control agreement and restrictions. So that needs to change. Transparency is the key. Second point is resilience. Of course, it's an important issue, but the point is that the proof of the hitting this, we must be more concrete. Turning towards our UK colleagues, I mean, there's various stories, financing of Cambridge University, the role of various people in the city, and that goes both for China and for Russia. So this issue needs to be tackled if we're not going to end up just with some sort of another declaration. Third issue is the question of naming the problems as it is. So, some people might remember this, there are missiles in the East and pacifists in the West. We can't have that. We can't have that. So we have to be very clear, much better, frankly, also in terms of public diplomacy and countering disinformation, who is to blame. And the last point is the power of a good example where we actually do stand up, particularly for those who are, if you like, weaker in this equation. And I think it was mentioned already, and that's a good thing, the case of Lithuania, which has come under tremendous, unbelievable pressure from extremely big and powerful country, which is China. And it's fair to say that the EU could have provided Lithuania with a bit more support on this issue. There's still time, but it needs to be done right now, because if you see the revisionist powers, if they apply this sort of rather crude methods of pressure against the weaker, and they get away with this, that will only essentially incite them to do more in that score. So I think the power of the good example, when we unite and push back, will actually do wonders, irrespective of all the very important language that we hope to see in the European strategic concept, NATO strategic concept and the European compass. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Alice, over to you. One question about the level of ambitions, but of course, if you would like to comment on any other parts, feel free to do that.
I think for the sake of time, I'll just say a few words about the European Intervention Initiative question, because I think this is yet another good example of a good idea that was very badly branded from the beginning. Announced in like big fanfare by Macron during the Sorbonne speech. This new European Intervention Initiative, even just the word intervention got the Germans very nervous about joining, which they didn't really want to do anyway, because they saw it as competition with the EU, etc. But I think we need to be very clear about what the European Intervention Initiative is, which is basically an informal grouping of defense attaches in Paris, very light touch institutionalization, and they meet and they basically do scenario planning, and they discuss, okay, if a crisis happens there, who wants to be involved, who could do what, etc. So it's actually off the radar. It's very much at the working level, which is not at all how I think it has been framed at the beginning. And a big question that a lot of countries had before joining would be, to what extent is this just a French way of making us talk about the Sahel again? What's the ownership of this? Can we actually talk about something else than just the Sahel? And now what is working at the E2I is that there is a working group about the Caribbean, for instance, which goes back to the point about high intensity or not. Disaster relief in the Caribbean led by the Netherlands. They're also talking Baltic security. They're talking Sahel, obviously. The idea is more to build strategic convergence in practice by having those defense attaché and those people from countries that France deems more willing and able than others to be active outside of Europe and outside of the European continent, talk to each other. So I think it's been, again, badly branded, but could be good and create strategic convergence, good for the EU and good for NATO. So I think, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. I am under very strict orders to end this session on time. So sincere apologies for those of you who wanted to take the floor. And I suggest that you bring the questions or comments forward during the break and lunch. But right now, I would like to first of all thank our panelists here in Warsaw and Daniel in London. But as we are doing here a little bit of the rearrangement, the technical rearrangement, I'll keep you occupied and I'll keep you hopefully amused. So thank you very much to the panelists. And I will just say that we discussed China, we discussed Russia, we discussed European strategic autonomy. Perhaps we didn't spend enough time highlighting the cooperation that UK and Poland have on issues on our immediate neighborhood. Because in Lithuania, in Belarus, in Ukraine, we are cooperating quite closely, and these are very practical channels of supporting Ukraine, supporting democratic opposition in Belarus. Also, when it comes to NATO, Daniel mentioned it a little bit, but there are a number of very specific joint initiatives that Poland and the UK are pushing together. So apologies if we didn't get to discussing things immediately across the border, but I think that discussion in session number 5 basically shows that we have a global outlook, not only UK traditionally, but also Poland. And hopefully we fulfilled a little bit this promise of showing to the wider audience that this is discussion that concerns also their security and their well-being. We also didn't discuss really the link between this traditional agenda of security and the new agenda, the issues of climate change or health emergencies that we discussed in the previous sessions. So one of perhaps the topics for the next year is how exactly do we manage to walk and chew gum at the same time? So, how do we make sure that the traditional deterrence and defense agenda stays, a traditional foreign policy agenda stays, but we also incorporate some of these new challenges which we discuss. So thank you very much. That's enough from session 5. And now we go to the closing segment of our Belvedere Forum. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Professor Zdzisław Krasnodębski, co-chair of the Belvedere Forum Steering Committee.
Okay, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I think it was very good meeting. So with broad range of the topics, youth, security, Joseph Conrad, and climate, of course, as a change. And I think it shows how important it is to meet physically. We are not digital beings. I was already sometimes invited to digital dinner, but I would say it is not the same to really to meet in person, to talk also unofficially. And so I hope that we will continue. For all these topics, there was a motive that was especially interesting for me, namely the EU, the role of EU. I am convinced that when we meet in the next year, we will see how the EU change. It is changing, and I think it is on the verge of a profound change, also because of the election in Germany and France, but I think you probably know we prefer this controversial, and there's no sure what would be the result, this conference of the future of Europe. But there is a huge debate also behind the scene about the future of the EU. And I think that the questions how our both countries relate to the EU will be crucial one. And on the end, I would like to thank you, especially Sir Malcolm, for your friendship for so many years. So it's very important to have such a good friend. And also, I would like to thank you, Chatham House and PISM. You're in a very difficult situation. On the end, I hope, of the pandemic, organize such an interesting meeting. Thank you very much.
Now, please join me in welcoming Sir Malcolm Rifkind, co-chair of the Belvedere Forum Steering Committee.
I would like to agree with Professor Krasnodębski that we've had a very stimulating couple of days. You know, the Belvedere Forum, over the last few years, it's been a period of a lot of introspection throughout the West, whether we're going through a period of serious decline, threats to Western values, threats to liberal democracy, and that has been something which has been a legitimate issue of concern and has been part of the discussions we've had. Some people are very pessimistic. I'm not. I'm an optimist. I remember once hearing an excellent description of the difference between optimism and pessimism. Pessimism is when you believe that things couldn't be worse. Optimism is when you know they could be. And I am a great optimist because I got involved in the political world involving foreign policy when I was a junior minister in the Foreign Office in 1980s, in the British Foreign Office, and I came for the first time to Poland in 1984. It was when Poland was experiencing martial law. The day I arrived, Father Popieluszko was being buried. The following day, I had an improper meeting in the British Embassy with 3 members of Solidarność, much to the consternation of the Polish government. And I remember the individuals, the names at the time meant nothing to me, but you'll recognize them: Tadeusz Wasilewski, Bronislaw Geremek, and Janusz Onyszkiewicz, who was taking part in this conference. So when you think of the transformation that took place in 1990, the vast majority of those benefits are still with us. I think what happens in the history of Europe and perhaps of the wider world is we have periods of great historic change, and you go through 4 or 5 years, sometimes 10, 15, 20 years of extraordinary progress, and then you have a setback. So the Reformation led to the Counter-Reformation, and the outcome of the First World War led to fascism and so forth. So there are two ways, but the overall march of both Europe and the wider world is in the right direction. The final point I want to make is simply this, that in 1990, two things happened. One was the external freedom of countries such as Poland, but throughout Eastern Europe that had been dominated by the Soviets since 1945, right up to the heart of Europe, half of Germany, half of Berlin, and all the countries to the east. So that was the external freedom that was achieved. But there was another freedom that was also achieved, and that was internal freedom. Because each of these countries that had escaped the Soviet control also adopted democratic structures of government, liberal democracy, freedom of speech, rule of law, most crucial of all. And you know, they still all enjoy it. So yes, there have been challenges, some questioning of some of these values. In some countries, things have happened that have rightly upset people as to whether there is a trend or whether it's simply isolated incidents. But compared to all the years after 1945 up till 1990, we still live in a Europe that is independent and free externally and internally. The only two countries that aren't are Belarus and Russia itself. So that is something which should cheer us up. And, you know, Belvedere is all about really the second of those freedoms, the internal freedom of Poland, of the United Kingdom, and of other European countries. So the dialogue that we have is about how that freedom is working, whether it can be improved, whether it's facing threats, and it is facing occasional threats from some people, occasionally from governments, and these are matters which are legitimate matters of public debate. You can't have that public debate in Moscow. You can't have it in Minsk, you can't have it in China. So Belvedere is an expression of these extraordinary historic changes that took place in 1990, and Poland was at the very center of that, and the United Kingdom was happy to play an important contribution. So I think Belvedere needs to continue. I think we've shown its continuing relevance, and the issues that we discuss will deserve to be discussed until the world has perfected itself, which will be a long time from now. Thank you very much indeed.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Sławomir Dębski, Director of the Polish Institute of International Affairs.
Well, I thought that all remarks which usually are being prepared for the closing session, I have already delivered during my opening remarks yesterday. But let me borrow one line from yesterday's Poland's Foreign Minister of Foreign Affairs speech, Professor Rau. He said that one of the most important lessons from the history is that knowing more about each other makes Europe safer. I think that's absolutely excellent statement. It could be one of the mottos of the Belvedere Forum for the future. Indeed, there is sometimes one may have perception that people in institutions like Chatham House or PISM, we are intended to think that, you know, going to China, going to North Korea, going to Tehran, Belarus, Moscow, is somehow more interesting because we are learning something from our adversaries. And sometimes we tend to think that our common opinion, our common values, our common stance are granted. The Belvedere Forum proves that it's not necessarily true. We have to work, talking to each other, exchanging views, comparing our notes to consolidate our free world and make Europe safer in this way. And the last thing, I've heard during the panel on focusing on climate change and how we should face this challenge, a distant noise of storm coming to the think tank world that may mean that one day carbon footprint would be imposed on think tanks. I believe that that's exactly the reason why Chatham House and PISM should cooperate in the future to find out the way to negotiate a kind of the rebate. So with this hope, I would like to thank all who contributed during this 5th edition of Belvedere Forum, and by their contribution made Europe safer. Thank you very much.
Please welcome to the stage Dr. Robin Niblett, Director of the Royal Institute of International Affairs, Chatham House.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Slavomir. Great to partner with you yet again. I'm standing between you and lunch, not just coffee, so that gives even more imperative to move quickly. Look, just 3 takeaways for me. I'm not going to do any effort to wrap up the great substance, but I think first, the last 2 days have reminded us what a substantive conversation you can have between Poles and Brits when you get them together, and on such a wide range of topics. The fact that we were able to literally cut across the waterfront from traditional security to energy transition to post-pandemic recovery to our shared culture and history in a global context. And I thought that conversation last night with Maya Jasanoff and great moderation actually by Patricia Sasnal was a really a way of sort of situating our people-to-people exchange in a really deep context and made it interesting. So knocked it backwards and gave it some perspective into the future. So great that we had such a substantive conversation and that we can. Second, the benefits of bringing together a really diverse group of participants in person and online. And sad that we couldn't have such a, all of that interaction together. But it's really constructive, actually, to sort of mix it up and to have people from a diverse group of perspectives, interests, and ages. And I think everyone enjoyed that Gen Z panel that Max moderated yesterday. It really kind of gave us a boost into the evening and a reminder that we need to really build that even more into our program, not just into our participation. I think going forward, a really dynamic civil society dialogue is one that is multi-generational, and we know that the next generation, in a way, want to own their future now. They don't want to be given it later on in their lives. Third, maybe just a sort of reflection, because I get sometimes a little maudlin, as they say in the UK, at the ends of these things. It does strike me that the UK outside the EU is making the effort to reach out. Officially, unofficially, those who thought it was a good idea to leave the EU, those who thought it was a bad idea to leave the EU. As noted in the first panel, the UK is still pretty divided. What country isn't? But there's a lot that the UK has ambition to do on the international stage. It's looking for partners, and the fact that we had such a great delegation coming over from the UK to participate is a reminder of how important we see Poland within that mix of partnerships as we go forward. Obviously, I don't know Poland as well as I'd like to know Poland, or I have many Polish friends, but it strikes me that while also divided, like the UK, and like so many other countries at the moment politically, it is an ever more dynamic society. It has the power to contest its future internally, but it has also resources, especially human, to give it a bright future and one that will therefore be a great partner to us as Brits as we go forward. So I'm just going to add, because I think I will, I'll repeat my words of thanks. Thank you, Slavomir, to you, your colleagues at PISM, and you carried a lot of the load on moderating the sessions this time round, and I know that's a heavy load always. Thanks so much to my Chatham House colleagues, Hans, Alice, others, those who are online. Anna Durant-Hayes, I'll call her out again because she puts so much effort into that, and from getting the delegation over this year and making sure we get them back, not completed yet, well, we could get stuck here, I can think of worse things, is so important. Many thanks to the British Embassy, FCDO, for their support in the event and more broadly for this whole initiative, and to their Polish counterparts in the MFA. To the panelists, I said it yesterday, and I'll say it again today, many thanks. I didn't thank enough the moderators yesterday. I will thank the moderators this time, because it is really a skill to bring as much out as you all did over these last 2 days. And thanks to all of you, those in the room, but especially all of you who've sat by your Zoom cameras these last couple of days, contributing great questions and being part of that community. We look forward to holding it together, and hopefully to seeing you in London next year. Many, many thanks. All the best.